Welcome back, friend. If you're settling in right now, maybe pulling a blanket a little closer, maybe dimming the light just a touch, then you are exactly where this story wants you to be. Tonight, we're going back, way, way back, to a world of marble columns and olive oil lamps, of togas and triumph parades of emperors and gladiators and grand speeches in the forum. But here is what I want to ask you. In all those stories about ancient Rome, the battles, the empires, the famous names carved into stone, did anyone ever stop to tell you about the girl who had no name of her own? Did anyone ever tell you that in one of the most powerful civilizations the world has ever seen, a daughter was often just called the feminine version of her father's name, and if he had two daughters, one of them was simply called the first, and the other was called the second, not a name. A number, that detail right there, that one quiet, almost unbearably ordinary detail tells you everything you need to know about the world we're stepping into tonight. This is not the Rome of Julius Caesar or Marcus Aurelius. This is the Rome of the women who stood behind them. The women who raised them managed their homes while they were off making history, held families together across decades of war and political chaos, and whose names, more often than not, were never written down at all. Tonight in part 1, we begin at the very beginning. We begin with a girl being born into a world that quite literally did not have a word ready for her. Let us start with something small, because the small things are always where the real story lives. In ancient Rome, naming a child was a serious business. Men had 3 names, a personal name, a family name, and a kind of nickname that often described something about them or their ancestors. It was a whole system, layered and specific, designed to tell the world exactly who you were and where you came from. Women had one name, and that one name was almost always just the feminine form of the family name, the nomen gentilicium, nothing more. So if your father was from the Julius family, you were Julia. If your father was from the Cornelius family, you were Cornelia. If your father was from the Claudius family, you were Claudia, simple, efficient. And if you think about it for even a moment, deeply revealing, because it tells us that in the Roman world a daughter was understood primarily as a member of her father's family, not as an individual with her own identity separate from his. And here is where it gets a little grim in that matter-of-fact way that ancient history sometimes does. If a man had 2 daughters, which was not uncommon, they would simply be called prima and secunda, the first one and the second one. If he had 3 daughters, the third became tertia, a fourth was quarta. Some Roman fathers did give their daughters personal nicknames. There is evidence of that. But those nicknames were informal, private, not official. They did not go on documents, they did not go on tombs. They were the kind of name that existed only in the soft, unrecorded spaces of family life, whispered in kitchens and courtyards, not inscribed in stone. I think about that sometimes. All those millions of women who lived and loved and grieved and laughed and managed entire households across centuries of Roman history, and so many of them reduced in the official record to a number or a family adjective. It feels like being erased before your life even begins. But let us be fair to the Romans for a moment, because context matters, and I think it is important not to look at the ancient world entirely through modern eyes. The Romans were not unusual in this. Almost every major ancient civilization structured itself this way. Women in ancient Greece had even fewer legal freedoms than Roman women. Women in many parts of the ancient Near East were similarly constrained by law and custom. The difference, and this is actually interesting, is that Rome over centuries developed a somewhat more complex and occasionally more generous framework for what a woman could actually do, even if the naming conventions suggest otherwise. Roman women, particularly in the later Republic and the imperial period, could own property. They could inherit. They could run businesses. Some of them accumulated extraordinary wealth and wielded real tangible influence over political events, even if they could not vote, could not hold office, could not stand in the Senate. We will get into all of that. all of it. But for now we are still at the beginning. A girl has just been born, and the first thing the world does is give her a name that is not quite hers. The next thing the world does is decide whether to keep her. This is the part that is hardest to sit with, so I want to say it carefully and honestly. In ancient Rome, a newborn child, girl or boy, was placed on the ground before the father. The father then made a decision. If he picked the child up, the child was accepted into the family and would be raised. If he did not, the child would be exposed left outside, usually near a rubbish heap or a crossroads, to die of the elements, or to be picked up by whoever passed by. Whoever picked up an exposed child might raise them as a servant or slave, or sometimes, if they were kind or childless themselves, as their own. This practice exposure was not considered murder under Roman law. It was considered a legal exercise of the father's authority over his household, a power so absolute that the Romans had a name for it, patria potestas, the power of the father. And while both boys and girls could be exposed, the historical evidence letters, records the occasional direct statement, suggest that girls were exposed at significantly higher rates than boys. There is a letter found in Egypt dated to around 12 years before the birth of Jesus, written by a Roman soldier named Hilarion to his pregnant wife Alice. He is away on duty. He tells her to take care of herself to make sure she eats well. And then, in the same casual tone, he adds, and I am paraphrasing the spirit of it rather than quoting it directly, that if the baby is a boy, keep it. If it is a girl, let it go. Let it go. Written in the same paragraph as instructions about eating enough bread. I do not want to romanticize the ancient world, and I do not want to condemn it in a way that pretends we are morally superior in every respect. But I do think it is worth sitting with that letter for a moment, because it tells us something about the value assigned to female life in the Roman world, not in an abstract philosophical sense, but in a practical, everyday, heartbreakingly ordinary sense. A girl's life from the very first breath was conditional. And yet, and this is the thing about history, the thing that always gets me, if a girl was accepted, if she was picked up, if her father decided to keep her, then she entered a world that had in its own complicated way a place for her. Not an equal place, not an easy place, but a real one. A Roman girl in a reasonably comfortable family would have had a childhood that looked in many ways surprisingly familiar to us. She played with dolls. Archaeologists have found Roman dolls made of carved bone and ivory with jointed arms and legs so they could be posed. They are about 15 to 16 centimeters tall, small enough to fit in a child's hand, and some of them are remarkably elegant, with delicately carved hair and tiny carved accessories. These dolls were not just toys. When a Roman girl got married, she was expected to leave her childhood dolls at the altar, as an offering to the household gods, a formal goodbye to the girl she had been. I find that ritual quietly heartbreaking, and also quietly beautiful. She also played with hoops and balls and a game similar to knucklebones, a kind of ancient jacks played with small animal bones. Roman art shows girls playing many of the same games as boys in their early years, running around courtyards keeping small animals as pets. There are graves of children who died young, and in those graves toys were buried alongside them, evidence of lives that were loved even in a world that had greeted them with such ambivalence. At some point the paths diverged. A boy would enter formal schooling and learn rhetoric, history, philosophy, the arts of public life, because public life was where he was headed. A girl would begin learning the skills of the household, not because she was considered stupid. Roman society, at least in its educated upper classes, did not exactly think women were incapable of learning. Some wealthy families hired tutors to teach their daughters literature, music, even philosophy. There is evidence that educated women were admired in certain circles, that a quick mind in a woman could be an asset to a powerful family. but the purpose of a girl's education was almost always the same: to make her a better wife and mother, to prepare her to run a household, to give her enough polish to reflect well on her family. Cornelia, the mother of the two famous Gracchi brothers, who would shake up the Roman Republic in the 2nd century, before the Common Era was legendary for her intelligence and her education. She corresponded with philosophers. She was considered one of the great women of Roman history, and historians celebrated her not primarily for her own mind, but for how that mind produced and shaped her sons. That tells you everything, really. A woman could be brilliant, but her brilliance was still most valued when it was in service of someone else. Here is the detail I keep returning to, though. Roman girls could be married at 12, legally, officially, with the blessing of law and society. Now the evidence suggests that in practice, most girls, especially those from working families, married somewhat later. Historians looking at tomb inscriptions and other records suggest that the average Roman woman married in her late teens or early 20s. Among the aristocracy, earlier marriages were more common, often for political reasons, because marriage in the upper classes was not really about love, it was about alliances. Families stitched themselves together through their daughters, but 12 was the legal minimum, and it was sometimes reached. There is something almost impossible to absorb about that sitting here in the modern world. A 12-year-old girl playing with her jointed ivory doll, and then perhaps the very next year leaving that doll at an altar and walking into a marriage to a man she may have met only a handful of times. The doll at the altar was not just a custom. I think it was a goodbye. A goodbye to the self that had existed before the world closed around her. But I do not want to leave you only with sorrow, because Roman women, as we will discover piece by piece across this entire series, were not simply passive recipients of whatever the world decided to do to them. Even in childhood, even within the tightest constraints, there were small freedoms, small acts of selfhood, small ways of being a person rather than just a function. Girls accompanied their mothers to temples. They participated in religious festivals that gave women a genuine public role, and we will talk about those festivals at length, because some of them were extraordinary. They watched their mothers manage households, negotiate with traders, make decisions that kept entire families alive. They absorbed from a very young age that the world required them to be capable, clever, and resilient, because no one was going to make it easy for them. And some of them, against all the odds the world stacked against them, became remarkable. We will meet some of those women in the parts ahead. We will sit with Cornelia, who raised sons that changed Roman politics and buried most of her 12 children. We will meet Hortensia, who stood in the Roman Forum and gave a speech so powerful that the men trying to tax her had to back down. We will spend time with a Vestal virgin, 6 women who lived in a 50-room palace, with heated floors, who could free condemned men with a gesture, and who paid for their extraordinary freedom with 30 years of absolute total enforced celibacy. We'll go into the parts of Roman life that the history books tend to skip: the kitchens and the courtyard gardens, the dye vats and the weaving rooms, the secret religious ceremonies that men were forbidden from attending on pain of serious consequences. We'll talk about beauty routines that used lead powder and could slowly poison the women who followed them. We'll talk about childbirth in a world without modern medicine where every delivery was a gamble. We will talk about the invisible economy that Roman women ran: the businesses they operated, the property they owned, the letters they wrote on thin wooden tablets that survived 2,000 years buried in the ground. We're going to tell their story, the whole story, not the one carved in marble, the one that was lived in the quieter spaces, in the flicker of an oil lamp at midnight, in the weight of a doll left on an altar, in the sound of a loom turning before the sun came up. So get comfortable. There is so much more to see. Coming up next, we're going to talk about weddings, and the Roman wedding had a detail that I promise you have never heard before. It involved a spear, a literal spear, and it had everything to do with the knot tied around a bride's waist on her wedding night. Stay with me. So we left off with a doll on an altar, a girl's last act of childhood, a quiet goodbye to the version of herself that existed before marriage claimed her. Now I want to take you somewhere a little more complicated, a little more layered, because the Roman wedding on the surface looked almost beautiful. There were flowers and white fabric and ceremony, and witnesses gathered in the light of an Italian morning. But if you looked closely, if you really looked, you would start to notice the details that told a different story underneath all that beauty. And one of those details was a spear, an actual literal spear, used on the bride's hair. I promised you this, and I keep my promises. Let us set the scene properly, because the Roman wedding deserves more than a quick summary. Imagine a girl, let us call her Claudia, because that is the kind of name she would have had. She's perhaps 16 years old, maybe 17, from a reasonably prosperous family in the city of Rome. Her father has arranged a match for her with a man, perhaps 10 years her senior, a man from a family of similar standing, a man whose family connections will serve her family's interests well. She may have met him. She may not have met him more than a handful of times. In the world of arranged aristocratic marriages, love was considered a pleasant bonus, not a prerequisite. The night before her wedding, Claudia does something that every Roman bride did. She takes her childhood toys, the jointed ivory doll we talked about, perhaps some knuckle bones, a small figurine, and she places them on the altar of the household gods. The lares and penates, the protective spirits of the family home. She is giving back to childhood what belongs to childhood, and then she puts on the wedding tunic. The tunic is white hand-woven, and this part matters because the weaving itself was considered a sign of virtue. A bride who had woven her own tunic was demonstrating in the most tangible possible way that she'd been raised correctly, that she was ready. Over the tunic went a belt, a special wool belt tied in a knot called the nodus herculaneus, the knot of Hercules. The knot of Hercules. Why, Hercules. The Romans believed this knot had a kind of protective magic, that Hercules, who was associated with strength and fertility and safe childbirth, had power tied up in its particular configuration. It was not just decorative, it was armour, and only one person was allowed to untie it. The husband, on the wedding night. When I first came across this detail, I had to sit with it for a moment, because it is so clearly symbolic, the bride's body literally wrapped and knotted, and the untying of that knot marking the formal beginning of the marriage in its most physical sense. There is something almost unbearably intimate about it, and also, depending on how you look at it, something that says quite a lot about who was in control of that intimacy. But back to the spear. Before the belt, before the white tunic, there was the hair. A Roman bride's hair on her wedding day was styled in a very specific way, 6 braided sections divided across the scalp. This was the same hairstyle worn by the Vestal virgins, the sacred priestesses of Rome. We will spend an entire chapter on the Vestals later, but for now just hold that connection in your mind, the most untouchable, celibate, sacred women in Rome, and a bride on the morning of her wedding wearing the same hair. The meaning is layered. The bride is in this moment like a Vestal pure, set apart, transitioning between one state of being and another. And to create those 6 braids, tradition held that the hair had to first be parted with the tip of a bent iron spear. Scholars have debated what this meant exactly, and honestly the Romans themselves may have performed the ritual for centuries without everyone fully remembering why. But the most widely held interpretation connects it to Rome's warrior culture, the idea that the bride was symbolically entering the household of a Roman man, a man shaped by military values, a man whose world was built on iron and discipline, and the willingness to fight. The spear that touched her hair was in a sense marking that transition. She was passing from her father's protection into her husband's, which sounds romantic if you do not think about it too hard, and a bit territorial if you do. Now here is something that I think gets lost when we talk about Roman marriage. We tend to flatten it to make it sound like an entirely grim transaction, an arrangement of property with no human warmth anywhere in sight. And some Roman marriages absolutely were that. But some were not. There is actual evidence in letters in epitaphs carved on tombstones, in the writing of men like Pliny the Younger, that some Roman couples genuinely loved each other, deeply and specifically, and in ways that feel entirely recognizable across 2,000 years. Pliny the Younger, who lived in the late 1st and early 2nd century of the Common Era, wrote letters to his wife Calpurnia while he was away on business that are, and I mean this genuinely, some of the most touching love letters I have ever encountered from the ancient world. He writes about how he cannot sleep when she is not beside him. He writes about how his hands reach for her in the night and find nothing there. He says that he spends his time rereading her letters to feel close to her, and that the letters make the longing worse, not better. This is a Roman man, in a toga, writing what is essentially a text message to his wife saying, "I miss you and I cannot sleep." Some things, it turns out, do not change. But, and this matters, Pliny and Calpurnia were unusual. They were also unusual in that Calpurnia was notably younger than Pliny, had been carefully educated, and had developed a genuine partnership with him. Pliny wrote admiringly of how she learned his speeches by heart, how she attended his readings with interest, how she composed little songs setting his poems to music. Was this love? Almost certainly. Was it also a relationship shaped fundamentally by an enormous power imbalance? Also yes. The two things existed together in Roman marriage all the time. That is the honest answer. It was not simply oppression, and it was not simply romance. It was a complicated human institution, inside a society with a very specific set of values, and the women navigating it were a great deal more complex than the law gave them credit for being. So let us talk about how the ceremony actually worked. Because there is more to it, and some of it is wonderfully strange. There were technically 3 main forms of Roman marriage. The oldest and most formal was called confarreatio, and this one was reserved for the highest patrician families. It involved an elaborate ceremony presided over by a senior priest in which the bride and groom shared a piece of sacred spelt cake, far in front of 10 witnesses. The cake was not a wedding cake in any modern sense. It was more like a ritual bread, and the eating of it together was the binding act the moment the marriage became real. This form of marriage transferred the bride entirely from her father's legal authority into her husband's. She became legally like a daughter to her husband's family. She was out from under her father's power, which sounds like freedom, until you realize she had simply moved from one man's authority to another man's. The second form was called coemptio, and here I want to be careful how I describe it because it has been summarized in ways that make it sound more brutal than the reality was, while also not pretending the reality was comfortable. Coemptio involved a symbolic transaction, a formal ritual gesture of purchase in front of witnesses. The groom presented a coin. The father received it. The bride was then symbolically transferred. Was she literally sold? The Romans themselves would have said no. They would have said it was a legal formality, a ritual acting out of the transfer of legal guardianship. But the symbolism is what it is, and I think it is worth naming plainly a woman's passage from one household to another was even in its ritual form framed as something that happened between 2 men, with the woman as the subject of the transaction, rather than a party to it. The third form of marriage, and this one is the most interesting to me, was called usus, meaning roughly use or habit. Under the older Roman law, if a man and a woman lived together continuously for a year, they were considered legally married. But, and this is the fascinating part, there was a loophole. If a woman left her partner's home for 3 consecutive nights during that year, the continuous cohabitation was broken, and she remained legally independent. She was not his wife under usus. She was her own person. Some women apparently used this deliberately. 3 nights away once a year to maintain their legal independence. I love that detail with my whole heart. In a world of very few official options, someone figured out a way to use the fine print. Let us talk about the procession now, because it deserves a moment. After the ceremony, the bride was formally escorted from her father's house to her husband's house. This was called the deductio, the leading away. She walked through the streets accompanied by torchbearers and musicians with her female companions around her, and the wedding guests following behind. 3 boys walked with her, specifically boys whose parents were both still living, because the Romans believed this was a good omen for the bride's future family life. One of those boys held her hand. One of them walked behind her carrying the wedding torch made of white hawthorn wood. The third carried a spindle and distaff, the tools of weaving, the tools of the matrona, the woman of the house. An object that was both practical and deeply symbolic. This is who you are now. You are the weaver. You are the keeper of the thread. When the procession arrived at the husband's house, the groom was waiting at the threshold. The bride was not supposed to step over it. That was considered bad luck. She was lifted over it, or she straddled it carefully. Before she crossed, she wrapped the doorposts with wool and anointed them with oil or fat. Another act of claim territory, a marking, "This is my home, now I am making it mine." And when she entered, the husband offered her fire and water, the 2 fundamental necessities of domestic life. You are the keeper of this hearth. This water is yours to use. This life is now yours to tend. Here is where I want to stop for a moment and ask you something, because I find myself genuinely curious about this. If you had been a Roman woman stepping over that threshold, or being lifted over it technically, what would you have been feeling? Because the sources we have almost all written by men tend to describe the wedding from the outside. The ceremony, the procession, the symbolic gestures, what the bride looked like, how she conducted herself. What she felt is mostly missing. There are a few exceptions. There are Roman poems, including some written by women, which we will talk about in a later part of this series, that hint at the complicated emotional reality of that moment. The mix of fear and anticipation and grief, and perhaps a thread of genuine hope. Because some of these women did hope for kindness, for compatibility, for a partnership, even if it looked different from anything we would recognize today. The Roman poet Catullus, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, wrote a wedding poem, Epithalamium, that contains a verse addressed to the bride directly. In it he acknowledges that leaving her mother's house is hard. He acknowledges the grief. And then he encourages her with the argument that a good marriage, a real partnership, is worth that grief. Whether Catullus was right is a question I will leave open. But the fact that he thought it needed to be said, that the bride needed to be persuaded that this was worth it, tells you something true about the emotional reality of what these women were walking into. Let us spend a moment now with what happened after the ceremony. After the torch was extinguished and the guests went home and the door was closed, because Roman society had very specific expectations about what a wife was supposed to be. The word that comes up again and again is univira, one-man woman. A woman who had been with only one man, her husband, and remained faithful to him for her entire life. This was considered not just morally ideal, but almost sacred. There were religious ceremonies, some of the festivals we'll discuss, where only women who could claim the status of univira were permitted to participate in certain rituals. Fidelity was not just a personal virtue, it was a civic one. And meanwhile, and I want to be straightforward about this because the double standard is so stark it needs naming, Roman men were not expected to be univiri. The equivalent concept for men essentially did not exist as a social ideal. A Roman husband could sleep with slaves, prostitutes, and willing lower-class women without any particular social censure, as long as he was not sleeping with another man's wife, or with a free-born Roman citizen outside of marriage. The rules were different. Emphatically, openly, unapologetically different. A wife who committed adultery could be divorced, publicly shamed, and in the earlier period of Roman history could even be punished by her own family under Patria Potestas, under the laws later introduced by the Emperor Augustus, who was deeply concerned about what he saw as a decline in Roman moral values. Adultery was made a criminal offence for women specifically. Augustus introduced legislation called the Lex Julia de Adulteris, the Julian law on adultery, around 17 or 18 years before the Common Era. Under this law, a husband who did not divorce and prosecute an adulterous wife could himself be charged with a crime. He did not have the option of quietly forgiving her and moving on. There is something almost Kafkaesque about that. A man forced to prosecute his own wife because the state had made private forgiveness illegal. And the deeper irony, which I find historically fascinating and also fairly maddening, is that this legislation was introduced by a man whose own daughter Julia would later be exiled by her father, who was also the emperor, for her various relationships outside of marriage. Augustus wrote the law, and then his daughter broke it, and then he enforced it anyway. The personal and the political colliding with all the grace of a chariot accident. Now, and I want to make sure we do not leave this chapter only on the hard notes, let us talk about what divorce actually looked like in Roman practice, because it is genuinely surprising. Compared to almost every other major civilization in the ancient world, Rome had a relatively accessible divorce system. Either spouse could initiate a divorce. It did not require a court proceeding. It was largely a matter of one party sending a formal declaration, and in the later Republic and Imperial period this could essentially be done by delivering a verbal or written notice in front of witnesses saying something to the effect of "take your things." The Latin phrase most commonly associated with the declaration of divorce was tuus res tibi habeto, take your own things for yourself, short, unambiguous. And while there was social stigma attached to divorce in certain circles, particularly for women for whom a second marriage carried slightly different social weight than a first divorce itself, was not uncommon, and was not the catastrophic social rupture it was in many other societies of the time. Women from wealthy families often retained their dowries after divorce, or at least portions of them depending on who was deemed at fault. Some women were divorced and remarried several times across their lives, particularly in the upper classes where marriage was so closely tied to political alliance that a shift in political winds often meant a shift in marital arrangements as well. Cicero, the great orator, one of the most famous Romans of the late Republic, divorced his wife Terentia after 30 years of marriage. He then married a much younger woman named Publilia. Primarily, it is widely thought, for access to her fortune to cover his debts. His daughter Tullia, whom he adored, genuinely adored, which is clear from his letters, was also divorced from her third husband and died shortly after giving birth to a child who did not survive. Cicero's grief at Tullia's death is one of the most raw, unguarded things he ever wrote. He withdrew from public life. He wrote a philosophical meditation on consolation. He seriously considered building her a temple, a literal temple, a shrine to his dead daughter. That level of grief, that specific and shattered love, it does not fit neatly into any story about Rome as a place where daughters were only valued for their marriages. People are always more complicated than the systems they live inside. So what do we take from all of this? I think what strikes me most looking at Roman marriage with some distance is how much was expected of these women, and how little of it was ever formally acknowledged. A Roman bride was expected to manage a household, and in the upper classes that meant managing what was essentially a small corporation with dozens of enslaved workers, multiple properties a guest list that could include visiting dignitaries, a husband's political reputation to protect and children to raise. All of that was her job. None of it came with a title. She was expected to be faithful in a world that did not ask the same of her husband. She was expected to be graceful about an institution she had little say in entering. She was expected to untie, metaphorically speaking, all the knots the world had placed around her, and to do it with dignity and without complaint. And many of them did exactly that. Not because they had no feelings about it, but because dignity in the Roman world was one of the few things that could never be taken from you. You could lose your husband, your fortune, your children, your name, but if you carried yourself with grace, if you conducted yourself with what the Romans called gravitas, that particular quality of steady, unhurried seriousness, you kept something that no law and no man could legislate away. The women who understood that were in their own quiet way formidable. Coming up in the next part of our story, we step fully inside the doors of that Roman household. Past the threshold the bride was lifted over, and we find out what a woman's daily life actually looked like once the wedding garlands had wilted and the real work began. Because running a Roman household was not a small thing. It was not gentle, decorative background work. It was power-complicated, unacknowledged, absolutely essential power, and the women who held it knew exactly what they were doing. Stay with me. Picture this. It is just past dawn in the city of Rome. The streets outside are already loud cartwheels on stone vendors, calling out the smell of bread baking somewhere nearby. But inside the walls of the Domus, the large townhouse of a prosperous Roman family, something else is happening. A woman is already awake. She has been awake for a while, actually. She is standing in the central courtyard, the atrium, going over the household accounts in her head, or perhaps on a small wax tablet because the grain supply needs checking, and 2 of the kitchen slaves have been arguing again, and there is a dinner party in 4 days for 12 guests, including her husband's most important political ally, and someone needs to make sure the good oil lamps are clean and filled, and the weaving that was supposed to be finished last week is still not finished, and her husband is still asleep. This is the woman we're walking into this chapter with. Not the bride on her wedding day, all white wool and hawthorn torches. The woman on the other side of that day. The one who woke up inside the life the wedding had delivered her into, rolled up her sleeves metaphorically, and sometimes quite literally, and got to work. The title that Roman society gave this woman was matrona, or sometimes mater familias. Both words carried enormous weight in the Roman imagination. They were not just descriptions, they were ideals, expectations, a whole philosophy of womanhood compressed into a single word. The matrona was supposed to be the moral and practical centre of the Roman household, modest in public, capable in private, dignified at all times, faithful as we discussed, frugal, industrious. The Roman writer Columella, who wrote in the 1st century of the Common Era, described the ideal Roman wife as someone who divided her time between the supervision of slaves in the indoor work and the oversight of outdoor agricultural tasks, a woman who was everywhere at once, overseeing everything, responsible for everything. And here is the thing about that description that I want you to sit with. Columella was writing that as praise. He meant it as an admiring portrait of female virtue. What he was actually describing, if we strip away the flattery and read it plainly, was an extraordinarily demanding executive role, with 0 official recognition, no salary, no title, and no legal authority independent of her husband's name. That is what the matrona was, a chief executive officer who did not exist on paper. So what did her day actually look like? Let us start with the household itself, because the physical space matters. A wealthy Roman family lived in a domus, a townhouse, organised around a central atrium, which was the main reception hall open to the sky, with a shallow pool in the centre called the impluvium to catch rainwater. Around the atrium were rooms, bedrooms, storage, the tablinum where the paterfamilias conducted business, and further back the triclinium, the dining room, and the private garden courtyard called the peristelium. The walls were painted, brightly vividly painted in deep reds and ochres and greens, with scenes from mythology, with architectural illusions, with birds and garden imagery. The floors were often mosaic. The house was in the upper classes genuinely beautiful, and the woman of the house was responsible for all of it. Not just the aesthetics, though she oversaw those too, but the actual functioning of this space as a living organism. A large Roman household might have dozens of enslaved workers. Some of them were highly educated. There were enslaved tutors, enslaved secretaries, enslaved physicians, enslaved entertainers. Managing those people, their assignments, their conflicts, their health, their productivity was a full-time occupation. The matrona allocated tasks. She supervised the food stores, the grain, the oil, the wine, the preserved meats and vegetables. She oversaw the preparation of food, though in a large household she wouldn't cook herself. She was the one who knew at any given moment exactly how much of everything they had and how long it would last. She also supervised the weaving. The weaving deserves its own moment because it was not incidental. It was central. Lanificium wool work was considered the defining virtue of the Roman woman. It appeared in epitaphs. When Romans wrote the highest possible praise for a woman on her tombstone, they often said something like she kept the house, she worked the wool. It was a formula, a kind of shorthand for she was everything a Roman woman was supposed to be. The Emperor Augustus, who had very strong opinions about Roman tradition and Roman values, reportedly wore only homespun clothing woven by the women of his own household. His wife Livia and his sister Octavia were said to have woven his garments themselves. Whether this is entirely true or somewhat embellished for political purposes, the point being made is clear. Even at the pinnacle of Roman power, the ideal woman expressed her virtue through weaving. Now I want to be honest here. For wealthy women, this ideal was mostly symbolic. They supervised the weaving. They did not necessarily do it themselves every day, hour after hour. They had enslaved women for that. But the symbolism mattered deeply. A matrona who was seen as idle, who was seen as uninterested in the domestic work that defined her role, was opening herself up to serious social criticism. The expectation of industriousness was never entirely optional, even for the richest women in Rome. For poorer women, and we'll come back to them because their lives were genuinely different, the weaving was not symbolic at all. It was survival. Women who worked as professional weavers or who took in spinning work for pay were doing one of the few forms of labour that was considered acceptable for a freeborn woman of modest means. Here is a question for you genuinely. When you imagine a Roman woman, what do you see? I would guess, and correct me if I am wrong, that you probably imagine someone wealthy, someone in a graceful painted room, someone with slaves around her, and a stola draped elegantly over her shoulder. But the reality of Rome was that most people were not wealthy. Most people lived in the insulae, those tall, crowded, often poorly constructed apartment buildings that rose 4, 5, 6 stories above the narrow streets. They had no running water in the upper floors, no private latrine, no kitchen in many cases. A woman living on the 4th floor of an insula in the Subbia district, Rome's notoriously crowded, noisy working-class neighbourhood, had a daily life that looked almost nothing like the matrona in the domus. She woke up in a small room she shared with her husband, possibly her children, possibly a lodger. She went down several flights of stairs to collect water from the street fountain, because there was no water above the ground floor. She cooked on a small portable brazier, an open charcoal stove because there was no proper kitchen. The fire hazard in these buildings was constant and terrifying. Rome had fires regularly, and the insulae were frequently their origin. She might work. Many lower-class Roman women did. They sold food from street stalls. They worked in taverns and food shops. They assisted in family trades. There is archaeological evidence from Pompeii, beautifully preserved by the eruption of Vesuvius, of women involved in the foolery trade, the bakery trade, the textile trade. Some ran their own small businesses. The legal framework said she needed a male guardian for formal transactions. The practical reality was that life did not always pause to wait for the correct male guardian to show up, and many women simply got on with things. Let us talk about what a matrona in a wealthier household actually controlled, because I think this is where the story gets interesting in ways that challenge the simple narrative of Roman women as powerless. The morning began early. The household slaves who slept in small rooms off the main corridors would begin their work before dawn. The matrona would wake, dress a process that in wealthy households involved a personal attendant helping with the stola, the hair, the small touches of presentation that announced her status to the world, and then begin her rounds. She met with the villicus or the household manager, sometimes an enslaved man, sometimes a freedman, to go over the day's requirements. Food purchases for the week, repairs that needed doing, the status of various ongoing tasks. She supervised the dispensator, the household treasurer, who managed the day-to-day finances under her oversight, and ultimately under her husband's authority, but in practice under hers because her husband was often not there. And this is the point I keep coming back to. Roman aristocratic men were frequently absent. Military campaigns, administrative postings in the provinces, political obligations that took them away for months or years at a time. Julius Caesar spent nearly a decade in Gaul. Countless other Roman men spent their careers moving between Rome and the edges of the empire. Who ran things while they were gone? The women. There is a letter from Cicero to his wife Terentia, written during his exile from Rome in the 50s, before the Common Era, in which he essentially hands her the management of their entire financial situation, including complex decisions about their properties and debts because he is not there, and there is no one else he trusts as much. He treats her in this letter as a full partner in their affairs, not as a subordinate receiving instructions, but as someone whose judgment he genuinely relies on. Terentia, for her part, managed his affairs competently enough that his financial situation did not collapse during his absence, which, given the precariousness of Roman political life, was no small achievement. There is another dimension to the matrona's power that rarely gets discussed, and I want to spend a moment on it. Social power. The Roman household was not just a private space, it was also a public one. The salutatio, the morning greeting ritual, was a daily event in upper-class Roman homes. Clients came to the house of their patron in the morning to pay their respects, to be seen, to request favours, to maintain the social bonds that kept Roman political life functioning. The paterfamilias received these clients in the tablinum. The woman of the house was not legally the patron, but she was present. She was observed. Her demeanour, her bearing, her evident competence in how the household ran, all of it was watched and noted and commented upon. A matrona who was known to be intelligent, capable, and well-connected was an asset to her husband, in ways that are hard to quantify but entirely real. She built relationships with other matroni. She cultivated connections across the web of elite Roman social life. She knew things: who was in favour, who was falling, which family was in financial difficulty, which alliance was quietly fraying. The Romans had a word for the kind of conversation that happened between women in these social contexts. Sermons, mulibres, women's talk, and men in the sources often dismissed it as gossip. But gossip in a world without a free press and without transparent political institutions is actually information. And information is power. The women who moved through those networks, who attended the right dinners, who were present at the right religious ceremonies, who maintained the right friendships across the right families, were doing something genuinely important even if it was never given an official name. I want to tell you about a specific woman now because she illustrates this better than any general description can. Her name was Aurelia. She was the mother of Julius Caesar. We do not have a biography of Aurelia. We do not have her letters. We barely have her name in the sources, and when she does appear, she appears largely as a supporting character in her son's story. This is, of course, exactly the problem with women in Roman history. They are so often legible to us only through the men around them. But what the ancient sources do tell us in scattered references is this. Aurelia personally supervised the education of Julius Caesar from childhood. She did not hand him off entirely to tutors. She was present, actively engaged, directing his intellectual development. The ancient sources describe her as a woman of strict and traditional Roman values, but also of considerable intelligence and practical ability. She managed the family household, which was located not in the wealthy patrician neighbourhoods, but in the suburb, that same crowded working-class district we mentioned. The Caesars were an old patrician family, but not a rich one. Aurelia managed a household with limited resources and considerable social ambition, which requires a particular kind of ingenuity. And this is the detail that I find most striking when Pompeia Julius Caesar's second wife was at the centre of the scandal, involving the secret religious ceremony of the Bonadea. It was Aurelia who had been monitoring Pompeia's behaviour in the household. Aurelia, who had prevented the suspicious visitor from getting close to her daughter-in-law. Aurelia, who in a very real sense was still running the household, even after her son had married and technically taken over as paterfamilias. She was perhaps in her 50s by that point, and she was still the most capable person in the building. Caesar adored her. He did not make a political move without her knowledge. When she died in around 68 years before the Common Era, Caesar was in the middle of an important political campaign and interrupted it to return to Rome for her funeral. A man who had crossed the Rubicon without looking back paused for his mother. That tells you what she was to him, and by extension it tells you something about what the invisible power of a matrona could actually look like when it was fully exercised. But I do not want to make this chapter only about the powerful women at the top, because their experience was genuinely exceptional. For most Roman women, the wife of a small craftsman, the freedwoman running a food stall, the woman married to a soldier posted somewhere on the Rhine frontier, the household they managed was small, and the margin for error was thin. A soldier's wife waiting for her husband to return from a posting that might last years was not managing a domus with a painted atrium and a staff of educated slaves. She was managing survival, stretching the allowance that came through, keeping children fed and healthy, maintaining some kind of stability in a world where her husband might not come back at all. The Roman army paid soldiers, but the pay was not extravagant, and soldiers were technically not allowed to marry under formal law for much of the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, though many had partners and children regardless in arrangements that were socially recognized even if legally ambiguous. When a soldier died, his unofficial family had limited legal recourse. His woman and children might find themselves with nothing. The women who navigated those circumstances quietly without fanfare, managing impossible situations with whatever resources they had, were as much the matronae of their world as any aristocratic woman with a 50-room house and 100 slaves. Perhaps more so, because there is a particular kind of strength that comes not from having resources and using them well, but from having almost nothing and still finding a way to hold things together. Rome was built on that strength too. It just did not write it down. There is one more thing I want to leave you with before we move on, and it is something that struck me the first time I really thought about it. The Roman household, the domus, was not just a physical space, it was a religious one. The lares and penates, the household gods we mentioned in the chapter on weddings, were real presences in the Roman home. There was a shrine to them, the lararium usually in the kitchen or a central room, and it was tended daily. Small offerings, food, wine, incense, flowers were made at the lararium as part of the household routine. Who tended the lararium most consistently? The woman of the house. Not as a grand religious role, not as an official priestly office, but as one of the 10,000 small, unremarked acts of care that kept a Roman household alive and functional and spiritually maintained. There is something quietly moving to me about that. Every morning in homes across Rome, women made offerings at the household shrine, a small acknowledgement that the gods of the home needed tending, that the invisible things required attention, that the sacred and the everyday were not separate but wound together. It was the most private kind of religion, the most personal kind of power, and nobody wrote it down. Nobody needed to. It happened anyway. Coming up next, we're going to go deeper into that domestic world, into the wool, the thread, the loom that never stopped turning. Because the weaving I mentioned in passing earlier, it was so much more than cloth. It was status. It was virtue. It was the language the Romans used to describe what kind of woman you were and what kind of woman you were not. And the story of Roman women and wool has a twist in it that I think will genuinely surprise you. Stay with me. We are only getting started. There is a story the Romans loved to tell. It was not about a battle, not about a senator giving a thundering speech in the forum, not about a general crossing a river or a consul making a fateful decision. It was about a woman sitting at a loom. The woman's name was Lucretia, and the Romans told her story for centuries, passed it down, repeated it, held it up, as the image of everything a Roman woman was supposed to be. Here is the version they told. It is the late 6th century before the Common Era. Rome is still under the rule of the Etruscan kings. A group of Roman noblemen, including the king's son, are away on military campaign and fall into a debate, the kind of idle, competitive debate that men on campaign apparently had about whose wife is the most virtuous back home. They decide to ride back to Rome unannounced. Surprise inspection. They visit one household, then another. At each stop they find the wives of the other noblemen doing exactly what you might expect women to do when their husbands are away at war and they think no one is watching, feasting, laughing, enjoying themselves. Then they arrive at the house of Lucretia, and they find her sitting in the lamplight surrounded by her slaves working wool. Not at a party, not resting, working, in the middle of the night, at the loom. The men are apparently so moved by this that they immediately declare her the winner of the virtue contest, and that right there is the Roman ideal of womanhood distilled into a single image, a lamp, a loom, and a woman who never stops working even when no one is watching. Now I want to unpack this story carefully because it contains so much. First, the obvious question. Was Lucretia actually sitting at her loom at midnight because she loved weaving that much? Or was this a portrait painted with a very specific political and moral agenda? The answer is almost certainly the second one. The story of Lucretia was retold by the historian Livia several centuries after the supposed events, as part of a larger narrative about the fall of the Etruscan kings and the founding of the Roman Republic. Lucretia's virtue in Livia's telling serves a narrative purpose. She is the symbol of everything that is worth fighting for the pure, industrious, faithful Roman woman whose violation by a tyrant son becomes the spark that ignites revolution. Whether she was a real person, a composite, or largely a literary creation is something historians still debate. But the image the woman at the loom was absolutely real in the sense that it reflects genuine Roman values. This is genuinely what Roman society held up as the feminine ideal. And the fact that it was held up this way for centuries tells us something enormously important about what woolwork meant in the Roman world. It was not just fabric, it was virtue made visible. Let us get into the actual mechanics of it, because I think when you understand what woolwork physically involved, the picture becomes even more interesting. The process of producing cloth in the ancient world was extraordinarily labour-intensive. It began with raw wool fleece sheared from sheep, sometimes purchased, sometimes from the family's own animals if they had a rural estate. The raw wool had to be cleaned, picked apart, combed or carded to align the fibres, and then drawn out into a continuous thread through spinning. Spinning in the Roman world was done with a drop spindle, a weighted stick that was set spinning and allowed to hang freely, drawing the fibre into thread as gravity pulled it down. There were no spinning wheels yet. Everything was done by hand with that small weighted spindle twisting and pulling, twisting and pulling. A single tunic required an enormous amount of thread. Producing enough thread for a household's worth of clothing, and for any cloth that might be sold, meant hours and hours and hours of spinning day after day. Then the weaving itself on an upright loom, passing the thread back and forth through the vertical warp threads, building the cloth row by row. Then the finishing washing, stretching, sometimes fulling, sometimes dyeing. For a large household, this was a continuous operation. It never fully stopped. There was always more wool to clean, more thread to spin, more cloth to weave. And the woman of the house, whatever her actual level of physical participation, was supposed to be at the centre of all of it. Here is where the story gets genuinely fascinating to me. Because the Romans were absolutely adamant that respectable women should weave, and equally adamant that the opposite kind of woman, the woman who worked with her body in public, was disreputable. The stola that respectable women wore in public was, among other things, a signal this woman produces cloth she does not sell her labour on the street. Her body is domestic, private, sacred to her household, and yet archaeology tells a more complicated story. In Pompeii, that extraordinary time capsule preserved by the eruption of Vesuvius in the 79th year of the Common Era, there is evidence of women involved in commercial textile production at a significant scale. The city had numerous fulleries where cloth was cleaned and processed. There were dye workshops. There were weaving establishments that operated as genuine businesses, not just domestic operations. And women appear in these contexts, not just as workers, but sometimes as owners. A woman named Eumarchia, who lived in Pompeii in the early 1st century of the Common Era, was one of the most significant public figures in the city. She was a priestess, a patron of the building trade. She funded the construction of a large building in the forum that bore her name, and she was involved in the textile trade at a commercial level. She built her fortune partly through wool and cloth. She had a statue erected to her by the fullers, the textile workers of Pompeii. The fullers, the working people of the cloth trade, put up a statue for a woman. That is not a footnote. That is a declaration that this woman mattered to them, that her patronage was real and important, that her power was recognized even when the official systems of the city did not have a formal category for it. Eumarchia never held political office. She could not. But she had a building in the forum with her name on it, and a statue from the workers whose industry she supported. That is a different kind of power. And it grew directly out of the world of wool and cloth that Roman society had assigned to women as their domestic virtue. The loom, it turned out, could also be a business. Now I want to take you somewhere a little unexpected, because woolwork and the Roman social imagination around it had a reach that went far beyond the practical. The Romans told many stories in which spinning and weaving appear as metaphors for fate itself. The 3 fates, the parquet, were depicted as spinning women. One held the distaff with the raw fibre, one spun the thread of life, the third cut it. The thread of your life was spun by women. Think about what that means in a culture that publicly celebrated female spinning as the highest domestic virtue. The most cosmic and fundamental power in the universe, the power over life and death, was imagined as a woman's hands doing the work that women did every day. There is something there that I find almost unbearably poignant. The Romans simultaneously confined women to the domestic and assigned to that domestic world the greatest metaphysical power they could imagine. The loom was not just a loom, it was the machinery of fate. Let me bring this back to earth now, though, to the actual daily texture of woolwork in a Roman household, because the symbolic weight of it can make us forget that it was also just deeply relentlessly physical labour. The historian Columella, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, describes the ideal arrangement of a large rural estate, and notes that the vilica, the female manager of the household, often a senior enslaved woman or the wife of the estate manager, should oversee the woolwork, ensure the slaves are properly assigned their spinning quotas, and manage the production of cloth for the entire estate. Spinning quotas. This is important because it tells us that in a well-run large household, wool production was organised like a small factory. Enslaved women had daily targets. A certain weight of wool spun a certain length of cloth woven. Falling short had consequences. The matrona sat at the top of this system. She was not just participating in a symbolic act of virtue, she was running a production operation. And for the enslaved women at the bottom of that system, the loom was neither virtue nor metaphor. It was a quota. Day after day. Sometimes by lamplight, as Lucretia's slaves were doing in that famous story, though. Unlike Lucretia, they had not chosen to be there. I think it is important to hold both of those realities at once. The idealized image of the virtuous Roman woman at her wool, and the enslaved woman next to her, spinning the same thread with no freedom to stop. Let me tell you about something that surprised me when I first encountered it. The Romans had a very particular anxiety about women who did not weave. Not just a mild social disapproval, a genuine deep anxiety. There are references in Roman sources to women who spent too much time outside the home at dinner parties at the bath socializing. These women were described in terms that mixed moral concern with something closer to fear. A woman who was not at her loom might be anywhere, might be doing anything, might be, and the Roman male imagination goes directly here, unfaithful. The loom in this reading was not just a virtue signal, it was a surveillance mechanism. A woman at her loom was a woman whose whereabouts and activities were known. She was inside, she was visible, she was doing what she was supposed to be doing. A woman who was not at her loom was a woman who had left the frame, who had stepped outside the picture the Roman world had drawn for her. That was genuinely unsettling to Roman men in a way that they expressed through layers of moralizing and social pressure and occasional legislation. The Emperor Augustus, who appears in our story repeatedly, because he was obsessed with Roman moral values and kept trying to legislate virtue into existence, made pointed public gestures about the weaving done by the women of his household. He wore the homespun clothes, as we mentioned. He wanted everyone to know that in the household of the ruler of the world, women were still at their looms, because if the women in the emperor's house were weaving, then the empire was in order. The thread was still holding. Here is something I want to ask you genuinely. Do you have something in your own life that works this way, something that is both practical and symbolic, something that tells the world who you are simply by the act of doing it? I think most cultures have something like this. Work that is not just work, but also identity. Labour that carries a moral weight beyond its practical function. For Roman women, that thing was wool. And what interests me is that the women themselves seem to understand this, and some of them used it deliberately. There is a story, possibly apocryphal, but revealing regardless, about Cornelia, the mother of the Gracchi brothers, the woman we mentioned in our very first chapter. Cornelia was a widow for many years. Her husband had died relatively young, leaving her to raise 12 children, most of whom died before her. A foreign king sent envoys to Rome with a marriage proposal for Cornelia. She was wealthy. She was intellectually distinguished. She had connections to the most powerful families in Rome. It was a significant offer. She declined, and in some of the ancient tellings of this story, when visitors asked her later what she was most proud of, she gestured to her sons, her two surviving sons, the reformers Tiberius and Gaius, who would eventually shake up the Roman political world so thoroughly that both of them would be killed for it. She called them her jewels, not her jewels in a sentimental sense, her jewels in the sense that she had made them, that they were her work, her craft, her production. She had not woven cloth, she had woven men, and in the Roman value system which prized the production of capable, virtuous Roman citizens above almost everything else that was the highest form of the same labour, the most important thread she ever spun was human. Let us talk about colour for a moment, because colour in Roman textiles was not decorative, it was a language. White wool undyed was associated with purity and was used in religious contexts. The toga of a Roman man running for office was bleached brilliantly white, which is actually where we get the word candidate from the Latin candidus, meaning bright white. Purple was power. The deep Tyrian purple extracted from sea snails, it took thousands of snails to produce a small amount of dye, which made it extraordinarily expensive, was associated with royalty, and later with the emperors themselves. Senators wore a broad purple stripe on their toga. Equestrians wore a narrow one. Red and saffron yellow were festive colours. Saffron yellow, as we mentioned briefly in the wedding chapter, was the colour of the bride's veil, the flammeum. A Roman woman's clothing told you her status before she opened her mouth. The stola in a woman's particular colour, the dye of a particular quality, the fineness of the weave, all of it communicated information that Roman society could read at a glance. This is why sumptuary legislation laws restricting what people of different social classes could wear was such a recurring feature of Roman political life. Colour and fabric were so effective at communicating status that the Romans kept trying to regulate them to make sure no one was wearing purple, above their station, so to speak. Women were subject to these codes too, and women of the lower classes or women of dubious social standing were sometimes assigned particular garments that mark their status as clearly as any official document. The toga that adulterous women were forced to wear, the garment of prostitutes and men, was exactly this kind of marking. The clothing announcing what the law had decided you were. Clothing as verdict, cloth as judgment. The loom in the end produced more than fabric. I keep returning to Livia. Livia Drusilla, wife of the Emperor Augustus, mother of the Emperor Tiberius, one of the most powerful women in the history of Rome, about whom ancient sources are frankly wildly contradictory. Some ancient writers present her as a model of traditional Roman virtue. Devoted wife, industrious manager of the household, weaver of her husband's garments. Other ancient writers, particularly later ones with particular political axes to grind, present her as a scheming, manipulative presence behind the throne, potentially involved in the convenient deaths of various people who stood between her son and the succession. The truth is probably somewhere in between, and also probably more interesting than either version. What strikes me about Livia is that she managed to hold both identities at once, the virtuous matrona at the loom and the politically sophisticated operator behind the scenes, and she did it so effectively that Augustus never, as far as we know, felt threatened by her. She understood the Roman system well enough to work within its symbols while operating well outside its official boundaries. She wore the homespun. She wove the cloth. She kept the household running with impeccable efficiency. And she also, according to multiple ancient sources, had conversations with Augustus about matters of state, maintained her own extensive network of political relationships, and outlived her husband to become one of the most influential figures of the early empire. The loom was her cover story. Or perhaps, and I think this is actually closer to the truth, it was not a cover story at all. Perhaps she genuinely believed in the virtue of the work and also in the value of political acumen. Perhaps she did not see a contradiction between weaving Augustus's tunic and understanding exactly which senators were loyal and which were not. Perhaps the Roman matrona at her best simply refused to choose between the domestic and the powerful. She held the thread and the political map in the same capable hands, and that right there is where we are heading next. Because what Livia represents is a particular kind of woman who appears again and again throughout Roman history, and we have only glanced at her so far. The woman who was not supposed to have power, who had it anyway, who changed the course of Rome without ever holding a single official title. Coming up, we're going to step out from behind the loom and walk into the forum and into the private gardens and dinner rooms where the real decisions were being made. We're going to meet the women who shaped Roman history from the shadows. Some of them you may have heard of. Most of them I suspect you have not. Stay close. The most remarkable part of this story is just beginning. Somewhere between the ages of 6 and 10, a Roman girl's life could change completely, not through marriage, not through the death of a parent, not through war or plague or any of the ordinary catastrophes of ancient life. It could change because a man knocked on her father's door. Not a suitor, a priest. The highest priest in Rome, the Pontifex Maximus, travelling through the city with a specific purpose. Looking, evaluating, searching among the daughters of Rome's most prominent families for a particular combination of qualities: physical wholeness, both parents still living no obvious defects of speech, or hearing the right age, the right family, the right bearing. He was looking for a Vestal virgin, and if he pointed at your daughter and said the ancient ritual words Te amata capio, I take you, beloved, your father had no legal right to refuse. Your daughter belonged to Rome now. For the next 30 years, I have been wanting to get to the Vestal virgins since the very first chapter of this series, because their story is unlike anything else in Roman history. It is unlike anything else in the ancient world, really. And I think it is one of the most psychologically complex institutions that any civilization has ever created around women. On the surface, it looks like this 6 women chosen as children, forbidden from marriage, and from all physical intimacy for 30 years, tasked with keeping a sacred fire burning in a round temple in the center of Rome. That is the simple version. The real version is so much stranger and more layered, and depending on how you look at it, either more tragic or more remarkable. Possibly both at the same time. Let us start with the fire itself, because the fire is the beginning of everything. In the temple of Vesta, which stood near the eastern end of the Roman Forum, a flame burned continuously. Not occasionally, not seasonally. All the time, every day, every night, through summer heat and winter rain, through wars and political upheavals, and the changing of emperors, the flame was the hearth of Rome. Not metaphorically, though, it was absolutely that too, but practically in the Roman religious imagination, the flame in Vesta's temple was the communal hearth of the entire city. Every Roman home had its own hearth. Vesta's flame was the hearth of the home that contained all homes. If it went out, Rome's divine protection went with it. The Romans genuinely believed this, not as a vague superstition in the background of their thinking, but as a central operational belief that shaped policy and public life. When the flame went out, and it did go out occasionally despite everyone's best efforts, it was treated as a state emergency. Prodigies were reported. Religious experts were consulted. The fire was relit using specific ancient methods, including the use of a special fire-starting technique involving a wooden board, rather than, say, a nearby kitchen hearth, because the flame had to be pure and ritually correct, not just warm. The women responsible for that flame carried the fate of the city in their hands every single night. Now, who were these women really? The Vestals were chosen from patrician families, the old noble families of Rome in the early centuries, though later this was expanded to include daughters of the equestrian class. They had to be between 6 and 10 years old at the time of selection, physically whole and healthy, with both parents living and free from any disgrace or legal taint. Once chosen, they served for 30 years. That number 30 years was divided into 3 periods of 10 years each. The first decade was training, learning the rituals, the calendar, the correct performance of dozens of ceremonies. The second decade was active service, performing the rites, maintaining the flame, participating in the full ceremonial life of the order. The third decade was teaching, passing the knowledge on to the newest initiates. After 30 years, a Vestal was free. She could leave, receive a state pension, and technically marry if she chose to. Most did not. Plutarch, writing in the late 1st and early 2nd century of the Common Era, notes this with a kind of puzzled sadness. He says that the women who did choose to marry after their service generally did not seem happy, that they appeared to regret it, that the other Vestals watched them go with something that looked like pity. I've thought about this a great deal, and I think, though, I want to be careful because we cannot know for certain what these women felt that after 30 years of being the most important women in Rome, of having freedoms that no other Roman woman had, of living in a palace, and being treated with a reverence that bordered on the sacred, the prospect of becoming an ordinary wife in an ordinary household, subject to an ordinary husband's authority, may have felt like a profound step down. Liberty once experienced is very hard to give back. Let us talk about what that liberty actually looked like. Because the privileges of the Vestals were extraordinary by any standard, and by the standards of Roman women they were almost incomprehensible. The Vestals lived in the Atrium Vestae, the House of the Vestals, a building that stood immediately adjacent to the Temple of Vesta, and is one of the best preserved sites in the Roman Forum today. In the imperial period it was a large, elegant complex, 3 stories, approximately 50 rooms, organised around a long central courtyard with reflecting pools and garden plantings, statues of distinguished Vestals lining the walkways. The building had heated floors. Underfloor heating, the hypocaust system where hot air circulated beneath raised floor tiles, was a significant luxury in the Roman world. Public baths had it. Wealthy private homes sometimes had it. The Vestals had it. They also had indoor plumbing. Running water in the building supplied by Rome's aqueduct system at a time when most Romans collected their water from public fountains in the street. They ate well. They were attended by slaves. They did not cook. They did not do laundry. The menial domestic labour that defined the daily life of virtually every other Roman woman was done for them by others. Are you seeing the irony here? The women who were held up as the symbolic centre of Roman domestic virtue, the keepers of the hearth, the most sacred housekeepers in the world, were the only women in Rome who did not have to actually do housework. I find this quietly hilarious and also deeply revealing. The Vestals were performing domesticity as a cosmic act. They were not actually doing it. They were embodying it at such a high symbolic level that the literal domestic tasks were beneath them. But the privileges went far beyond comfortable housing. A Vestal virgin had legal independence that no other Roman woman had. She did not need a male guardian, a tutor, to conduct legal transactions. She could sign contracts. She could make a will. She could own property in her own name. She was exempt from the patria potestas, the absolute authority of the father, from the moment she was taken into the order. She answered to no man, only to the college of priests, and through them to the gods. She could travel through Rome in a carriage, a right normally reserved for men of significant status. Lictors, the official attendants who accompanied magistrates and carried the faces as symbols of Roman power, walked before the chief Vestal when she went out. If a condemned prisoner on the way to execution happened to cross her path, she could pardon him on the spot. No paperwork, no appeal. She said the word and the man went free. That is not symbolic power. That is actual operational immediate power over life and death. Think about what that means in a world where most Roman women could not sign a legal document without their husband or father standing beside them. The Vestals walked through Rome with lictors and the power of pardon. They also served as the keepers of Rome's most important secrets. The wills and private documents of Rome's most powerful citizens were deposited with the Vestals for safekeeping. Julius Caesar left his will with them. Mark Antony attempted at one point to access documents held by the Vestals that could have been politically inconvenient and was refused. The Vestals also guarded certain sacred objects of enormous religious importance, including objects that had allegedly been brought from Troy by Aeneas himself, the legendary ancestor of the Roman people. The contents of the inner sanctuary of Vesta's temple were considered so sacred that almost no one, including most of the priests, ever saw them. Only the Vestals knew what was truly kept there. They were the guardians of Rome's origin story quite literally, and they kept those secrets for centuries. Now I have to talk about the part of the Vestal's life that is hardest to discuss, because it is the part that throws all the privilege and the freedom into a very different light, the vow of chastity. For 30 years a Vestal virgin was forbidden from all physical intimacy. This was not just a rule. It was considered the foundation of everything, the source of the sacred power that made the order work. The Vestal's purity was in the Roman religious imagination the engine of Rome's divine protection. If a Vestal broke that vow, the consequences were catastrophic. Not just for her personally, though the consequences for her personally were as severe as the Roman world could devise but for Rome. An unchaste Vestal was not just a disgraced woman, she was a spiritual catastrophe, a breach in the wall between Rome and the divine anger of the gods. A Vestal found guilty of breaking her vow was buried alive. This was called being entombed. She was taken to a small underground chamber near the column gate, given a small amount of food and water placed inside, and the entrance was sealed. The Romans did not consider this execution technically. They were not allowed to shed the blood of a Vestal, that itself would be a religious violation. So they created a legal fiction. She was provided with food and water, the entry was closed, and whatever happened next was considered to be between her and the gods. What happened next was not complicated. Between 483 and 91 years before the Common Era, at least 10 Vestals were condemned for breaking their vow and suffered this fate according to ancient sources. Some historians believe the number is higher, with some cases not fully recorded. And I want to say something here that I think is important, and that the ancient sources tend to glide past. Not all of those women were guilty. Roman political history is full of moments when the Vestals became convenient targets during times of crisis, when military defeats, famines, or political disasters were interpreted as divine punishment for some pollution in the sacred order. When people needed a reason for Rome's misfortunes, accusing a Vestal of unchastity served multiple purposes. It explained the divine anger, it removed a woman of potential political inconvenience, and it created a very dramatic public narrative of purification. Some of the ancient sources themselves express doubt about specific condemnations. There are cases where the evidence was clearly thin, where the accusation seems to have been politically motivated, where the condemned woman maintained her innocence to the end, in ways that later writers found troubling. These were children who had been taken from their families, their lives shaped entirely by an institution they had no choice in entering, and who could be destroyed legally publicly with religious sanction, on the basis of an accusation that was sometimes genuinely impossible to disprove. That is the shadow side of the Vestal's extraordinary position. The privilege and the peril were two faces of the same coin. Let me tell you about a specific case because it brings all of this to life in a way that no general description can. In the year 114 years before the Common Era, 3 Vestals were simultaneously accused of breaking their vow: Emilia, Licinia, and Marcia. The accusations arose in the context of a broader Roman anxiety about divine disfavour, following the death of a young noble girl struck by lightning on horseback, and various other unsettling events that the Romans interpreted as bad omens. The first tribunal, convened by the Pontifex Maximus, acquitted 2 of the 3 women and convicted only Emilia. The Roman people, the assemblies, the populares, the ordinary citizens who had opinions about everything, were apparently not satisfied with this result. They demanded a broader investigation. A special court was convened. This time all 3 women were found guilty. Whether they were actually guilty is something we will never know. The ancient sources disagree about the evidence. What we know is that the political pressure for a more dramatic resolution was significant, and that the result of that pressure was 3 women condemned and buried. 3 women whose names we still know 2,000 years later: Emilia, Licinia, Marcia. I say their names deliberately because I think they deserve to be said. Here is the thing about the Vestals that I keep turning over in my mind. There is a version of their story that presents them as victims, taken as children imprisoned in a life of enforced celibacy, living under the constant threat of a brutal death. And there is another version that presents them as the most privileged women in Rome, free, respected, powerful, independent in ways that no other Roman woman could dream of. Both versions are true, and I think the reason the Vestals fascinate us so much, the reason they have fascinated historians and writers and storytellers for 2 millennia, is precisely because they refuse to be reduced to either version alone. They were both. They were free and they were trapped. They were powerful and they were vulnerable. They were sacred and they were used. The Roman world needed them to be all of those things simultaneously, because the institution only worked if it was simultaneously exalting and terrifying. The reverence had to be real, and so did the threat. And the women who lived inside that institution, who tended the fire for 30 years, who learned the rituals and kept the secrets, and walked through Rome with lictors and the power of pardon, they navigated that contradiction every single day. Some of them, I think, found genuine meaning in it, genuine dignity, genuine freedom in the particular form that the institution offered, imperfect and constrained as it was. The chief Vestal, the Virgo Vestalis Maxima, held her position for decades in some cases. The ancient writer Tacitus notes that a woman named Oxia presided over the Vestals for 57 years. 57 years! She must have been a remarkable person. She must have had a kind of authority and presence and institutional knowledge that made her genuinely formidable. She oversaw the training of countless younger Vestals. She participated in state ceremonies alongside the most powerful men in Rome. She maintained the flame for 57 years. We do not know what Oxia thought about her life. We do not know if she was content. We do not know if there were things she grieved, choices she wished she had been allowed to make. But we know she kept showing up. Every morning for 57 years she tended the flame, and Rome for 57 years did not fall. There is a small lovely detail I want to leave you with before we move on. When a Vestal retired, when her 30 years were complete and she stepped out of the order and back into ordinary Roman life, she received a dowry from the state. A formal, official, generous financial settlement provided by Rome as a kind of acknowledgement that she had given her youth to the city. And then Rome gave her something else. A choice. The first real, unconstrained, fully legally independent choice many of these women had ever had in their lives. She could marry. She could remain single. She could live where she wanted, do what she wanted, structure her days according to her own preferences for the first time, and as we noted, most of them chose to stay as they were, not from obligation, from preference. They had tasted a particular kind of freedom inside their sacred constraints, and they had no interest in trading it for the ordinary freedoms of ordinary Roman womanhood, which came with their own considerably heavier set of chains. That choice, quiet personal made by women whose names barely survive in the historical record tells us something that no law, no ceremony, no amount of official documentation ever could. It tells us what freedom felt like when a Roman woman finally got to hold it in her hands. Coming up next, we step away from the sacred and into something altogether more human. We have talked about the women who were supposed to stay invisible, the wives, the weavers, the keepers of the flame. Now we're going to meet the ones who refused. The women who walked into the Roman Forum and spoke, who influenced wars and political purges and the succession of emperors, who left their fingerprints all over Roman history in ways that men tried and largely failed to erase. Cornelia, Hortensia, Civilia, Fulvia, names that should be as famous as Caesar or Cicero, names that mostly are not. That changes right now. Stay with me. The year is 42 before the Common Era. Rome is bleeding. The republic, that grand complicated argumentative experiment in self-governance that had lasted nearly 5 centuries, has effectively died with Julius Caesar 2 years earlier on the steps of the Senate. Now 3 men calling themselves the Second Triumvirate control the Roman world between them. Octavian, Mark Antony, and a man named Lepidus. They need money. Specifically, they need money to fund a war against the men who killed Caesar Brutus and Cassius, who are gathering armies in the east. And so the triumvirate does what Roman governments did when they needed money quickly. They published a list of names, not a list of donors. A list of the 1,400 wealthiest women in Rome whose property the triumvirate intended to tax directly and immediately. Roman women had never been taxed this way before. The precedent did not exist, and the women on that list, wealthy, educated, connected to the most powerful families in Rome, were furious. They sent delegations to the wives and sisters of the triumvirs, asking them to intervene. Octavian's sister agreed to help. Mark Antony's mother agreed to help, but Mark Antony's wife Fulvia, and we will come back to Fulvia because she is one of the most extraordinary people in this entire story, Fulvia turned them away. The women were left with one option. They would have to speak for themselves. What happened next is one of the most remarkable scenes in Roman history, and it is one that I think deserves to be far more famous than it is. A woman named Hortensia walked into the Roman Forum. She stood before the tribunal of the triumvirs, and she gave a speech. Not a quiet petition, not a polite request delivered through a male intermediary. A full formal public oration, in the tradition of the great Roman orators with argument and rhetoric and moral force, delivered by a woman to the most powerful men in the world, in the public heart of Rome in front of a crowd. The Roman Forum was not a gentle space. It was noisy, crowded, politically charged, the stage on which Roman public life was performed. Every great speech in Roman history, and there has been many, had been given there by a man. Hortensia was the daughter of Quintus Hortensius, who had been one of the greatest orators of the previous generation, the man who had sometimes defeated Cicero in the courts, before Cicero eclipsed him. She had clearly learned from her father. She had probably spent years listening, absorbing, practicing a craft that the world had decided she would never need. She needed it now. The speech she gave, which was preserved and still survives in paraphrased form in the writings of the historian Appian, made several precise and devastating arguments. Why should women pay for a war they had no voice in starting? Women could not vote. Women could not hold office. Women had no say in Roman foreign policy or military decisions. They had no stake in the political disputes that had brought Rome to this crisis. Why then should they fund its resolution? She made a historical argument Roman women had contributed to the treasury before voluntarily in genuine emergencies, specifically during the Second Punic War, when Hannibal was threatening the city and everyone sacrificed. That was a war for survival. This was a war between Roman men for Roman power. That was different. And she made a personal argument: if the triumvirs seized their property, where would these women go? Their fathers, husbands, brothers, sons had already been caught up in the violence of the civil wars. Some had been killed. Some had been exiled. The women were trying to hold what remained of their families together. To take their property now was to destroy what little stability remained. The crowd apparently responded well. The triumvirs were not pleased. They tried to have her removed. The sources say the lictors, those official attendants with their symbols of power, attempted to push back against the women who had come with Hortensia, and that there was a moment of genuine confrontation, the crowd growing louder, the situation tipping towards something uglier. And then the triumvirs backed down. Not completely. They reduced the number of women subject to the tax from 1,400 to 400. They added wealthy male citizens to the list instead. It was not a total victory, but it was a victory. A woman had walked into the Roman Forum, given a speech that history remembered, and changed the outcome. I want to pause here and ask you something. When you think about who gets to speak in public, who gets to stand up and argue and demand and be heard, do you ever think about how recently that changed? How fragile it still is in parts of the world. Hortensia spoke in 42 before the Common Era. Women in the United States did not gain the right to vote until 1920, nearly 2,000 years later. That gap is worth sitting with for a moment. Not because the Roman world was progressive, it absolutely was not. And Hortensia herself was exceptional, a product of unusual privilege and unusual talent. But because it tells us that the capacity was always there. It was never a question of whether women could think, argue, persuade, lead. It was always a question of whether the world would let them. Hortensia let herself. And 2,000 years later, her name is still here. Now let me introduce you to someone whose name you may actually know, but whose story you probably do not know fully. Cornelia. Not the Cornelia of Part 1, who briefly appeared as the famous mother of the Gracchi. Let us actually spend time with her now, because she deserves it. Cornelia Africana, so called, because her father was Scipio Africanus, the general who defeated Hannibal and effectively saved Rome from Carthaginian conquest, was born around 190 before the Common Era into one of the most illustrious families in Roman history. She married a man named Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, a distinguished senator, and together they had 12 children. 12 children. She buried 10 of them. Only 3 survived to adulthood, a daughter, Sempronia, and 2 sons, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. I want you to hold that number for a moment. 10 children dead. In a world without modern medicine, this was not unusual. The infant and childhood mortality rate in ancient Rome was staggering, perhaps 40% of children dying before age 5. But knowing that it was common does not make it easier. Cornelia grieved 10 times in ways we can only imagine. Her husband died when her surviving children were still young, leaving her a widow at around 40 years old. She did not remarry. She had offers. The most famous of which, as I mentioned in an earlier chapter, came from Ptolemy VIII, the king of Egypt, who apparently sent envoys to Rome with a marriage proposal. Cornelia, widow of a Roman senator, mother of Scipio Africanus's grandchildren, was a significant enough figure that a king considered her worth pursuing. She declined. The ancient sources record her reason simply she had her children to raise. That was it. That was the reason. No dramatic speech, no philosophical treatise on widowhood, just I have work to do. And the work she did was extraordinary. Cornelia turned her household into something that did not officially exist in the Roman world, an intellectual salon, a centre of learning, a place where philosophers, writers and thinkers gathered alongside politicians and military men. She corresponded with the Greek philosopher and historian Polybius, who spent years in Rome and left accounts of Roman life that are still invaluable to historians today. She wrote letters, fragments of which survive though scholars debate their authenticity, that show a woman of sharp mind and genuine rhetorical ability. She personally supervised the education of Tiberius and Gaius, with an intensity that the ancient sources describe as remarkable even by Roman standards. Not just their academic education, but their character formation, their values, their sense of what Rome was and what it could be. The Gracchi brothers grew up to become the most significant reformers of the late Roman Republic. Tiberius, as tribune of the plebs in 133 before the Common Era, proposed land reforms that challenged the entrenched interests of the Roman aristocracy and sparked a political crisis that ended in his death, killed by a mob organized by his senatorial opponents. Gaius continued his brother's work 10 years later, pushing further reforms before he too was killed by his enemies. Both brothers died for ideas about justice and reform. Those ideas were shaped in significant part by their mother. There is a question that historians have debated for centuries: how much of the Gracchian reform movement was Cornelia's political vision, expressed through the only vehicles available to her, her sons. We cannot know for certain, but we know that she was deeply involved. There are letters attributed to Cornelia, their authenticity debated but their existence telling, in which she appears to counsel her son Gaius, to shape his strategy to push back on his methods while endorsing his goals. A woman directing a political movement through her son. The hand behind the hand. There is a famous story about Cornelia that I want to tell you because it captures something essential about who she was. A wealthy Roman woman, the wife of some prosperous man pleased with her jewels and her fine things, was visiting Cornelia one afternoon. The conversation turned, as it apparently did in wealthy Roman households, to the subject of jewellery. The visitor showed off her own collection, her rings, her necklaces, her earrings, the careful accumulation of gold and gems that announced her status to the world. And then she asked Cornelia politely, but with perhaps a hint of competitive curiosity, to show her jewels in return. Cornelia waited until her sons came into the room. She gestured toward them. "These," she said, "are my jewels." I have always found this story almost unbearably moving, not because it is simply a charming anecdote about maternal love, though it is that, but because of what it represents in the Roman context. Cornelia was making an argument, a public, pointed, deliberate argument. In a world that valued women primarily as producers of property and status, she was redefining what production meant. Her value was not in what she had accumulated. Her value was in what she had made. Not fabric, not jewellery, not a well-managed household, though she had all of those things too. She'd made citizens, thinking, capable, politically engaged citizens who were going to try to change Rome. That was her work, that was her craft, and she knew it. Let me bring in another woman now, because the story of female influence in Rome is not just the story of exceptional mothers and exceptional speeches. It is also the story of information, of knowing things, of being at the centre of networks that the official history of Rome tends to ignore. Civilia, half-sister of Cato the Younger, one of the most famous moral conservatives in Roman history. Mother of Marcus Junius Brutus, yes, that Brutus, the one who stood over Julius Caesar's body on the Ides of March, and for many years the most significant woman in Julius Caesar's private life. Civilia and Caesar had a relationship that lasted in some form for decades. The ancient sources are clear about this. Suetonius, writing in the early 2nd century of the Common Era, describes their relationship directly, and notes that Caesar gave her a pearl worth 6 million sesterces. 6 million sesterces, an amount that would have represented a significant fortune even to wealthy Romans. But here is what interests me about Civilia. She was not just Caesar's lover, she was his confidant, his political ally. a woman who moved at the absolute centre of the most turbulent political period in Roman history, connected by blood marriage and relationship to almost every major figure of the late Republic. Her son Brutus would kill Caesar. Her half-brother Cato would be Caesar's most implacable enemy. Her daughter, Junia Tertia, was married to Caesar's assassin Cassius. Civilia was embedded in the conspiracy that ended Caesar's life through the closest possible human ties. Her child, her in-law, her sibling, while having been for years the woman closest to Caesar himself. Whatever she knew, whatever she felt about the Ides of March, we can only guess. She left no memoir, no confession, no letter that survives in full, but she was there, at the centre of it all, knowing everything connected to everyone navigating the most dangerous political waters in the world. That is not a footnote, that is a protagonist. And then there is Fulvia. I saved her for last in this chapter because she is the most unusual of all the women we've met unusual, even by the standards of remarkable Roman women, which is saying something. Fulvia was married 3 times each time to one of the most powerful and controversial men in Rome. Her first husband was the populist politician Publius Clodius, the same man who crashed the Bonadea ceremony in women's clothing, and caused the scandal that led to Caesar divorcing his wife, which we mentioned in Part 2. Her second husband was another politician named Curio. Her third husband was Mark Antony. Are you seeing a pattern Fulvia was drawn to or drew to herself? Men who lived at the absolute edge of Roman political life. Men who were brilliant and dangerous and impossible to ignore. When Clodius was killed, murdered on a Roman road in a political ambush, Fulvia appeared at his public funeral and tore her clothes and wept publicly and loudly, in a way that the ancient sources describe with a mixture of admiration and discomfort. She turned his funeral into a political event. She made sure that Rome felt his death. When Mark Antony went east to pursue his campaign and his relationship with Cleopatra, and left Roman affairs in a precarious state, Fulvia did not wait quietly at home. She raised troops in Italy. On her own authority, or as close to her own authority as a Roman woman could get working in conjunction with Antony's brother Lucius. She organized resistance to Octavian. She conducted military operations. Ancient sources describe her wearing armor not as a metaphor but apparently as a reality, inspecting troops, giving orders, being present at the strategic center of a military campaign. The ancient writer Dio Cassius, writing several centuries later, describes Fulvia as a woman who had no interest in spinning or managing a household, who wanted power and used her husbands as instruments to get it. Dio meant this as criticism. I read it as a description. Fulvia did not fit the model. She never tried to. She looked at the Roman system that assigned women to the loom and the private courtyard, and she went somewhere else entirely. She was not universally admired for this. She was mocked, criticized, blamed by Cicero with particular viciousness in ways I will not repeat in detail, but which were personal and cruel, and revealed more about Cicero's own anxieties than about Fulvia's actual conduct. But she was also feared, and fear in a world that refused to grant you respect is its own kind of acknowledgement. Fulvia died in 40 before the Common Era in exile in Greece, estranged from Antony with the world she had fought for collapsing around her. She was perhaps 35 years old. She never stopped moving. What do Hortensia, Cornelia, Civilia, and Fulvia have in common? On the surface, not that much. Different families, different methods, different temperaments, different relationships to the Rome they moved through. But underneath one thing, each of them understood that the official map of Roman power left women off the page, and each of them found a way to be present in that power anyway. Through speech, through sons, through information, through sheer refusal to stay where the world had put them. They did not have titles, They did not have votes. They did not have offices or armies in their own names. What they had was something that Roman society could not fully regulate no matter how many laws it passed. Presence, intelligence, the stubborn, irreducible fact of being a person in a world that kept trying to reduce them to a role. History, with all its imperfections and biases, could not quite erase them, and I think that is worth something. Coming up next, we're going to turn from what these women did to how they looked, and why it mattered far more than you might expect. Because in ancient Rome, the way a woman dressed, the way she styled her hair, what she put on her face in the morning, none of it was personal. None of it was private. It was all a statement, a declaration, a verdict about who you were and where you stood in the Roman world. And some of the things Roman women used to be beautiful, the creams, the dyes, the powders, were slowly, silently, elegantly doing something terrible to them. That story is next. Right, so let me ask you something personal. How long does it take you to get ready in the morning? 10 minutes 30. An hour if you're having one of those days where nothing looks right and you end up back at the beginning. Now imagine that getting ready was not just a personal routine but a public declaration, that every single choice you made, the colour of your dress, the style of your hair, whether you wore a veil or left it off, whether your lips were tinted or bare, was being read by everyone around you as a statement about your moral character, your social class, your marital status, and your relationship to the laws of the Roman state. That was the reality for Roman women every single morning. Getting dressed in ancient Rome was not self-expression. It was communication. And the penalties for getting it wrong were not just social embarrassment. They could be legal. Let us start with the clothing, because it is the most immediately visible layer, and because the Roman system of dress for women was, once you understand it, one of the most precisely engineered systems of visual control that any civilization has ever produced. The garment that defined respectable Roman womanhood was the stola. It was a long full-length overdress worn over a lighter undertunic. It typically had straps at the shoulders and a band the instita sewn along the hem at the bottom, which distinguished it visually from other garments. The stola fell to the feet, covering the body completely in a way that communicated modesty, permanence, respectability. Over the stola, when a woman went outside, she wore the palla, a large rectangular piece of cloth draped over the shoulders, and sometimes pulled up to cover the head as well. This combination, stola and palla, was the uniform of the Roman matrona, the married woman, the respectable woman, the woman who belonged to a household who was under the protection of Roman law and the Roman social order. And when I say uniform, I mean it quite literally. It was a regulated category of dress. Only women of citizen status, married women, women of acceptable social standing were supposed to wear it. Now here is the striking part. Prostitutes wore the toga. The toga, the garment of Roman male citizens, of politicians and generals, and the men who ran the world, was also the required dress of women who were considered to have placed themselves outside the circle of Roman female respectability. Prostitutes, women convicted of adultery. Think about what that means. The most powerful garment in Roman culture, the one that said citizen, that said rights, that said I am a full participant in this civilization, was also used as a mark of disgrace for women who had broken the social code. The toga said you are outside the protection of Roman womanhood now. You have stepped out of the category that grants you dignity. You're something else. It was not a punishment in the physical sense. No one was flogged or imprisoned for wearing the wrong thing, at least not directly. But the social consequences were immediate and total. A woman in a toga was publicly categorized. Her legal status changed. Her ability to prosecute certain crimes against herself effectively disappeared. She was, in the eyes of Roman law and Roman society, a different kind of person. Cloth as verdict. We said it in the last chapter about the loom. It keeps being true. Now let us talk about hair, because Roman women's hair was, and I say this with genuine admiration for the sheer engineering involved, extraordinary. In the early Republic, Roman women's hairstyles were relatively simple. The hair was parted in the centre, pulled back and arranged in a modest bun or braid at the nape of the neck. Clean, controlled. The visual expression of Roman restraint and simplicity. By the imperial period, all of that had changed completely. The hairstyles of wealthy Roman women in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era were architectural. That is not a metaphor. They were literally architectural, built up in tiers and waves, and elaborate arrangements that required significant time, multiple attendants, and what appears from surviving sculpture to have been a small collection of specialized tools including heated irons, pins and nets. Archaeologists and hair historians, yes, hair historians are a real thing, and they deserve more credit, have spent considerable time studying the portrait busts of Roman empresses and elite women from this period, trying to reconstruct exactly how these hairstyles were achieved. What they have found is that the towering, elaborately curled structures seen in imperial portrait sculpture were sometimes partially achieved through the use of hairpieces, wigs and extensions made from the hair of other people. Often it seems from the hair of enslaved women, or from hair purchased in the provinces. A Roman woman's magnificent tower of curls might contain the hair of a woman from Germany or Gaul, or the eastern provinces, purchased in a market and sewn into an arrangement that bore no resemblance to anything that hair had been, while it was still attached to its original owner. There is something in that detail that I find quietly haunting. The complexity of the Roman beauty system resting as so much of Roman life rested on the invisible labour and the literal bodies of enslaved people. But the hair detail that genuinely stopped me when I first encountered it is this. The elaborate hairstyles of the imperial period changed with the fashions of the court. When a new empress came to power, or when an existing empress changed her style, women across the Roman world updated their hairstyles accordingly. This is documented in portrait busts found across the empire, where the hairstyle of the subject clearly reflects the fashionable style of a particular empress at a particular moment, which means that sculptors, when creating portrait busts for wealthy clients, sometimes made the heads with detachable hair sections, so that if the fashion changed, you did not need a new bust, you just swapped out the hair. There are surviving Roman portrait busts with these interchangeable hair sections. You can see the join line where the stone hairpiece attaches to the stone face, a woman's face in marble permanent and eternal, and a hairdo in marble ready to be swapped out when the empress changed her mind. Honestly, I find this more relatable than almost anything else in Roman history. The anxiety about being out of fashion is apparently timeless and civilizationally universal. Let us talk now about the cosmetics. And here is where the story takes a turn that is genuinely troubling, because what Roman women put on their faces in pursuit of beauty was in some cases slowly and silently harmful, in ways they had absolutely no way of knowing. The Roman beauty ideal for women emphasized pale, smooth skin. Dark or weathered skin was associated with outdoor labor with slaves and working people. A woman of status had pale skin because she was not spending her days in the sun. Paleness was wealth made visible on the body. To achieve and maintain that paleness, Roman women used a preparation called cerussa white lead. Lead carbonate ground to a fine powder mixed with water or other substances applied to the face, and sometimes the neck and arms. It made the skin brilliantly, luminously white. It was also, by any modern standard, a significant toxic exposure. Lead poisoning accumulates in the body over time, affecting the nervous system, the kidneys, cognitive function. Chronic exposure to lead through cosmetic use would have caused symptoms that might have been attributed to illness or age without anyone making the connection. Women who used cerussa regularly throughout their adult lives were absorbing lead through their skin day after day, year after year. They did not know this. The concept of chemical toxicity as we understand it simply did not exist in the ancient world. What they knew was that the preparation worked, it whitened the skin dramatically, and that beautiful, fashionable women used it. Some Roman writers did express concerns about cerussa not because of toxicity, but because heavy cosmetic use was considered morally suspicious. The same writers who criticized women for wearing too much makeup were accidentally, and for entirely the wrong reasons, giving advice that was genuinely protective. But the criticism was moral, not medical, and most women who wanted to participate in the beauty standards of their world used it anyway. There were other preparations too. For colour on the cheeks and lips, what we would call rouge or blush, Roman women used a preparation made from the dried bodies of a small insect called coccus, an early form of carmine dye, or from red ochre, a naturally occurring iron oxide pigment. These were applied to the cheeks and lips. For the eyes, Roman women used preparations similar to kohl, darkening around the eyes, with materials including stibnite, which is antimony sulfide. Again, not particularly good for prolonged skin contact, though far less acutely toxic than the lead preparations. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, who compiled an enormous encyclopedia of natural history in the 1st century of the Common Era, describes dozens of cosmetic preparations in meticulous detail, their ingredients, their methods of preparation, their uses. He is by turns fascinated and disapproving, as Pliny tends to be, about everything involving women's habits. He describes a preparation for removing freckles that involved urine, specifically the urine of a young boy applied to the skin. He describes hair dyes made from the fat of bears. He describes a tooth whitening preparation involving the ground bones of sea creatures. Roman beauty culture was, in a word, inventive, and in some cases inadvertently dangerous. Can I be honest with you about something here? When I first started really digging into the details of Roman cosmetics, the lead white, the complex preparations, the enormous amount of time and effort and physical discomfort that went into maintaining the beauty standards of this world, my first reaction was something between sympathy and frustration, because the pressure was relentless, and it came from every direction. Men criticized women for wearing too much makeup, calling it deceptive. The same men praised women for being beautiful. Beauty required work. Work required cosmetics. Cosmetics were criticized. It was an impossible standard, as impossible standards tend to be by design. The poet Ovid, who was simultaneously one of ancient Rome's most charming writers, and one of its most instructive case studies in male ambivalence about women, wrote an entire poem called Medicamina Faciae Feminae, which translates roughly as cosmetics for the female face. In it he gave women detailed recipes and advice for beauty preparations, and then in other poems he complained about women who wore cosmetics. He genuinely seemed to see no contradiction in this. I have thought about Ovid a great deal while working on this series, and my conclusion is that he was a brilliant writer and a complicated human being who reflected very accurately the contradictions that Roman society built into its treatment of women. He liked women. He was interested in women. He found them endlessly fascinating, and he also participated casually and constantly in a system that reduced them to their appearance and then criticized them for caring about their appearance. 2,000 years later, that particular combination of attitudes has not entirely disappeared, which is either reassuring because at least we're not alone across history, or profoundly depressing. Possibly both. Let us talk about jewellery now, because jewellery in Rome was one of the most precise status languages the world has ever developed. Gold was the highest material. Pearls were extraordinarily valuable. They came from the Persian Gulf and the coasts of India, and their price reflected the distance and danger of that journey. A single fine pearl necklace could cost more than a Roman soldier earned in a lifetime. The pearl that Caesar gave to Civilia, which we mentioned in the previous chapter, was valued at 6 million sesterces. To give you a sense of scale, a common Roman soldier was paid around 900 sesterces per year in the early imperial period. That pearl represented roughly 6,000 years of a common soldier's wages in a single piece of jewellery given to a woman. Jewellery was wealth, made wearable status, made visible love or political calculation, or both expressed in materials that outlasted everything else. And Roman women across all classes participated in this system to whatever extent their resources allowed. Wealthy women had elaborate gold settings with gemstones, emeralds from Egypt, sapphires from the east, amber from the Baltic coast, carried overland through thousands of miles of trade routes. Middle-class women had simpler gold or silver pieces. Working women might have bronze rings or small clay pendants. Archaeologists excavating sites across the former Roman world regularly find jewellery lost, buried, deliberately deposited as offerings. Each piece is a small window into a life. A woman who wore this ring on this finger in this city 2,000 years ago. Her name most of the time we will never know. But the ring is there. One more thing I want to cover in this chapter because it connects the personal and the political in a way that I think is genuinely illuminating. The Romans passed sumptuary laws regulating personal spending and luxury goods multiple times across their history. These laws tried to limit the amount of gold and precious metals that women could wear, the value of dresses they could own, the number of dining couches they could have at a feast. Almost every sumptuary law in Roman history was partially or entirely ignored. This is historically documented. The laws were passed. The behaviours continued. New laws were passed. The behaviours continued. Cicero himself noted somewhat exasperatedly that sumptuary legislation tended not to work. And why did it not work? Partly because enforcement was difficult, partly because wealthy Romans felt entitled to display their wealth and resented restrictions, but partly, and this is the part that I find interesting, because Roman women pushed back. There is a famous account preserved by the historian Livia of an incident in 195 before the Common Era, when the tribune Marcus Porcius Cato, known to history as Cato the Elder, one of Rome's most famous moral conservatives, was attempting to maintain a wartime sumptuary law that restricted women's gold and dress. The women of Rome gathered in the streets, not quietly, not privately. They gathered in public in numbers and went to the houses of the tribunes who supported the law, asking them to repeal it. They blocked access to the forum. They were present, visible, vocal. The law was repealed. The women went home with their gold. Cato was reportedly furious. And I think about that moment Roman women in the streets, not over voting rights or legal personhood, but over jewellery. And I find it rather than trivial entirely human. They were fighting for the one language of status and selfhood that the Roman world permitted them. When you've been told you cannot vote, cannot hold office, cannot speak in public, cannot sign a contract without a guardian, the gold ring on your finger starts to mean something beyond decoration. It becomes the one thing you're allowed to own completely. Of course they fought for it. So we come to the end of this chapter with something that I want you to carry forward. Roman women's appearance, their clothing, their hair, their cosmetics, their jewellery, was simultaneously a cage and a language. The system of rules around it was designed to contain and categorize them. And within that system, women found ways to speak, to assert, to resist, to declare themselves present. The Stola said, "I am respectable. I am protected, I belong here." The elaborate hairstyle said, "I have resources, I have time, I have people who serve me." The pearl said, "I was valued enough for this." The gathering in the streets to repeal a sumptuary law said, "We are here and we will not be erased without a fight. Every layer of the Roman woman's appearance looked at closely enough is a story she was telling about herself in the only language the world had officially given her. And speaking of languages the world had not officially given women in the next part of our story, we're going to step into a space that was entirely exclusively powerfully theirs. A ceremony held in secret, a room that men were forbidden from entering, a night in December when the most powerful women in Rome gathered without their husbands, without their fathers, without a single male presence in the building, and did things that no man was ever supposed to know about. The Bonadea, the good goddess, the secret that nearly destroyed Julius Caesar's marriage and led to one of the most dramatic political scandals in Roman history. That story's coming up right now. Every December something unusual happened in Rome. The men left. Not all the men in the city, obviously. The streets were still full, the forum was still busy, the taverns were still loud, but in one specific household, whichever household had been chosen to host the ceremony that year, always the home of a senior Roman magistrate, a consul or a praetor, the men of that house packed their things, took their male slaves and vacated the premises entirely for the evening. The women moved in, the doors closed, and whatever happened inside those walls for the next several hours was officially, absolutely, non-negotiably, none of anyone else's business. This was the Bonadea ceremony, the rites of the good goddess, and it is one of the most fascinating, most debated, most genuinely mysterious events in the entire Roman religious calendar. Let me tell you what we know first, and then we can get into what we do not know, because both halves of that story are remarkable. The Bonadea, the good goddess, was one of the oldest deities in the Roman religious tradition. Her actual name was considered so sacred that it was never spoken publicly, which is why she was simply called the good goddess. Even her closest devotees referred to her by that title rather than her true name. She had a temple on the Aventine Hill, one of Rome's 7 hills dedicated to her worship. That temple was maintained exclusively by women and was off limits to men entirely, not just for ceremonies, but as a general rule. Men were not supposed to enter it at all. Her sacred animals were snakes which were kept in her temple precinct and considered protective presences. Wine was officially not permitted in her temple. It was referred to by another name when used in her rites called milk, and the vessel containing it was called a honeypot. This elaborate euphemism was apparently maintained seriously and consistently. Now, the annual ceremony in early December was the centerpiece of the Bonadea's religious year. It was held in a private house rather than the temple hosted by the wife of the senior magistrate currently holding the ceremony. The Vestal virgins attended. The elite women of Rome attended. The exact number varied, but this was a gathering of the most significant women in the city. The men cleared out. The house was prepared with elaborate arrangements of branches and greenery. Specifically, myrtle was excluded for reasons connected to a mythological story about the goddess that the sources hint at but never fully explain. And then the rites began. Here is what we do not know. We do not know exactly what the rites involved. This is not an accident. It is not a gap in the historical record caused by poor documentation. The secrecy was the point. The women who participated were bound to absolute silence about the specific content of the ceremonies. The sources, almost all of which are male, because of course they can tell us the broad outlines, the general atmosphere, some fragments of information, but the heart of what happened in that room in the lamplight with the doors closed and the men gone that was kept. It was kept for centuries. And I find that genuinely remarkable. In a world where Roman women had almost no space that was entirely their own, no official meetings, no public voice, no institutions of their own, the Bonadea ceremony was a room that belonged to them completely, a space that even the most powerful men in Rome could not enter. not Caesar, not Pompey, not the consuls or the tribunes or the men who commanded armies and decided the fate of nations. Not one of them could walk through that door. The women had one room, and they kept what happened in it absolutely to themselves. What the ancient sources do tell us with varying degrees of reliability and varying degrees of visible male discomfort is that the ceremony involved music, dancing, wine drunk freely under its euphemistic name, and religious rites performed by the women themselves without any male priestly oversight. That last point is significant. Roman public religion was almost entirely administered by men. The major priestly colleges, the pontifices, the augurs, the fetiales were male institutions. The Vestals were the great exception, but even their religious role was technically supervised by the Pontifex Maximus. The Bonadea ceremony had no male oversight at all. The women performed the rites, offered the sacrifices, conducted the religious observances, and reported to nobody about what had transpired. The ancient writer Juvenal, writing in the late 1st and early 2nd century of the Common Era, and it should be noted that Juvenal was a satirist with a strong agenda and a deep skepticism about women in general, wrote about the Bonadea with gleeful hostility, suggesting that the ceremony was an occasion for all manner of improper behaviour. Most serious historians take Juvenal's account of the Bonadea with significant skepticism. He was writing satire, he was writing for a male audience, and his portrayal of women's secret religious ceremonies as debauched gatherings reflects a very specific male anxiety about what women might do when unsupervised rather than any reliable historical record. But here is the thing about Juvenal's account that is actually historically useful. The anxiety itself is real. The fact that Roman men, even men of education and sophistication, were genuinely unsettled by a room they could not enter, tells us something important about power. It tells us that control in the Roman world depended heavily on visibility, on knowing where women were and what they were doing. The Bonadea ceremony took that visibility away for one evening, and the discomfort it produced in the male literary record is almost palpable. One room, one night, a year, and men were writing anxious satire about it centuries later. Now we get to the scandal. The year is 62 before the Common Era. Julius Caesar is the praetor of Rome, one of the senior magistrates, and his house has been selected to host the Bonadea ceremony that December. Caesar himself, following the custom, has vacated the house. He's somewhere else for the evening. The house belongs to the women. His wife Pompeia is hosting. His mother Aurelia, the remarkable woman we discussed in Part 3 who had been managing the household and monitoring her daughter-in-law's behaviour with characteristic vigilance, is also present. And then somewhere in the middle of the ceremony something goes wrong. One of the female attendants notices something odd. A figure among the women who does not seem quite right. Moves differently. Seems uncertain about where to go. Is perhaps a little too tall. Aurelia investigates, and discovers that one of the people in the house dressed as a woman is a man. His name is Publius Clodius Pulcher. He is a Roman nobleman, a populist politician, and he has apparently disguised himself as a female musician in order to gain access to the ceremony. Why the ancient sources suggest that Clodius was conducting a romantic pursuit of Caesar's wife Pompeia, and that he had entered the house in disguise in order to meet with her privately. Whether Pompeia was complicit in this scheme or was herself an unwitting target of his attentions, the sources disagree. But the outcome was immediate and catastrophic. The ceremony was halted. The rites were considered polluted. A man had entered the sacred space, had seen things no man was permitted to see, had contaminated the religious integrity of the entire event. The Vestal virgins who'd been present would later be required to repeat the ceremonies in their entirety to restore the proper sacred order. Clodius was arrested and put on trial for sacrilege. The trial became one of the most spectacular political dramas of the late Republic. Cicero, who had been present at a dinner party with Clodius on an earlier occasion, and thus could testify that Clodius's alibi was impossible, gave evidence against him. Clodius was acquitted apparently through extensive bribery of the jury, and became Cicero's implacable enemy for the rest of his life, eventually engineering Cicero's exile from Rome. Caesar divorced Pompeia, not because he believed she was guilty of anything. When asked directly, Caesar said he did not believe Pompeia had done anything wrong, but he said, and this is the line that has echoed through history, Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. Not guilty, not complicit, just associated with a scandal, just present in a house where something improper had occurred. That was enough. She was divorced. I want to stay with that moment for a little while because I think it reveals something profound about the position of Roman women, even wealthy, well-connected aristocratic Roman women, in a way that no legal text or philosophical argument can quite match. Pompeia did nothing wrong by Caesar's own account. She was divorced anyway, because the appearance of propriety mattered more than actual innocence, because a man's political reputation required that the woman associated with him be not just innocent but unimpeachable, because the moment her name and Clodius's name were in the same sentence, her value as a political asset had been compromised. She was not a person who had been wronged. She was a liability that has been managed. I do not say this to condemn Caesar specifically. Caesar was a product of his world, and his world had very specific rules about these things. But I think it is important to name it plainly because the plainness of it is part of the story. Roman women navigated a world where their reputation was simultaneously their most valuable possession and the one thing over which they had the least control. It could be destroyed by someone else's actions, by rumour, by association, by the ambitions or carelessness of men they had never chosen to be connected to. And the formal mechanism for managing a compromised reputation was divorce, which, as we discussed in Part 2, was easy and relatively shame-free in Roman law. From the husband's perspective, anyway. Let us come back to the Bonadea itself, because I do not want the Clodius scandal to be the only thing we take from it. The scandal matters, but so does what was happening before the scandal interrupted it. Women gathering together, performing religious rites without male supervision, keeping secrets that they maintained for centuries, creating a space physical, temporal, spiritual that was entirely their own. In a world that offered women so few spaces of their own, this one mattered enormously. And I think it is worth asking, what did the Bonadea mean to the women who participated in it? Not to the satirists who wrote about it afterward. Not to the men who were anxious about it. Not to us looking back with 2,000 years of distance. What did it mean to walk into that lamplight, to hear the door close behind you, to look around and see only women? The most powerful women in Rome, yes, but also just women for one evening in a space where the rules were different. I think it meant something close to freedom. A very specific, very temporary, very carefully contained freedom, but real. The kind of freedom that comes not from having no constraints, but from stepping briefly outside the particular constraints that govern you every other day. From being somewhere that your husband's name and your father's name and your social position do not follow you quite as heavily as they do everywhere else. From being for one evening not someone's wife or someone's mother or someone's daughter, just a woman at a ceremony, in a room that was hers. There were other religious spaces in Roman life where women found something similar. The cult of Isis, the Egyptian goddess whose worship spread throughout the Roman world during the imperial period, attracted enormous numbers of female worshippers and gave women significant participatory roles in its ceremonies. The priestesses of Isis conducted rites, carried sacred objects in procession, through the streets shaved their heads as a sign of dedication. The cult of Cybele, the Phrygian Great Mother, had similarly prominent female participation. Her worship was ecstatic, emotional, physically expressive in ways that Roman official religion was not. It offered something that the controlled, formal, male-administered ceremonies of Roman state religion did not offer: permission to feel things publicly, permission to express devotion with the whole body. Later in the imperial period, mystery religions from the eastern provinces spread through Rome's population, including forms of early Christianity, which in its earliest iterations offered women roles of genuine community leadership that were unusual by Roman standards. Women were drawn to these spaces, I think, for reasons that are entirely understandable. The official Roman religious calendar gave women a role, but it was a role defined by others, administered by others, evaluated by others. The mystery cults, the Bonadea, the private household shrines we discussed in Part 3, these gave women something different. They gave women religion as a personal experience rather than a civic performance. They gave them access to the sacred on their own terms. Here is a question I genuinely want to leave open for you to think about. When a group of people is systematically excluded from official power, when they cannot vote, cannot hold office, cannot speak in the formal spaces where decisions are made, they almost always create unofficial spaces. Places where their own authority is recognized, their own knowledge is valued, their own experience is considered legitimate. The Bonadea was one of those spaces for Roman women. The weaving rooms were another. The private shrines, the letters between women that we know existed even though most of them have not survived. The relationships between women in the elaborate social network of Roman aristocratic life, women who knew each other across marriages, across decades, who helped each other's children, who remembered things together. There is a term that scholars sometimes use for this parallel culture, the culture that develops alongside the official culture in the spaces the official culture leaves empty. Roman women had a parallel culture. It was real, it was functioning, it mattered, and it is almost invisible in the historical record because the historical record was written by the people who ran the official culture and had very limited interest in what was happening in the parallel one. Every now and then something breaks through. The Bonadea scandal breaks through because a man invaded that space, and the fallout was politically significant enough to be recorded. But all the evenings when nothing dramatic happened, when the doors simply closed, and the rites were performed, and the secrets were kept, and the women went home at the end of the night. Those evenings are silent in our record. Thousands of them, centuries of them, silent. One final thing before we move on. After the Clodius scandal, the Senate passed a resolution requiring the Bonadea ceremony to be repeated properly to cleanse the religious pollution of the intrusion. The Vestal virgins oversaw the reperformance of the rites. The ceremony continued. It was not cancelled. It was not abolished. It was not handed over to male priests for proper supervision. It continued, held annually in the homes of Roman magistrates, with the men clearing out and the women filing in for another several centuries. The last recorded mention of the Bonadea ceremony in the ancient sources comes from the late 4th century of the Common Era, more than 400 years after the Clodius scandal. The ceremony was still happening. The doors were still closing. Whatever those women knew, whatever they kept it to the very end. Coming up in our next chapter, we step away from the sacred and into something altogether rawer and more immediate. We have talked about religion as a space of freedom, but there was another space in Roman women's lives that offered no freedom at all, only risk and pain, and the most fundamental kind of courage: childbirth in ancient Rome, a world where every pregnancy was a gamble, where the goddess of childbirth was prayed to with genuine desperation, where the death of a mother in labour was so common that it shaped the entire emotional landscape of family life, and where women found, even in that most vulnerable moment, ways to be something more than just the body the world had decided they were. That story is next. Of all the things a Roman woman faced in her life, the arranged marriage, the household management, the legal constraints, the constant pressure of public expectation, there was one experience that stood apart from all the others, not because it was the most unjust, not because it was the most politically significant, but because it was the most physically immediate, the most intimate, the most terrifyingly beyond anyone's control. Childbirth. In a world without modern medicine, without sterile environments, without any real understanding of infection or blood loss, or the dozens of complications that can arise when a human being brings another human being into the world, childbirth in ancient Rome was the moment when a woman's life balanced on the thinnest possible edge. And Roman women knew it. They knew it the way you know something that lives in your body rather than your head. Not as an abstract statistical risk, but as a presence, a quiet, constant awareness that this ordinary, universal, essential human act could be the last thing they ever did. The numbers where we can piece them together are sobering. Demographic historians studying ancient Rome estimate that somewhere between 1 and 2 women died for every 100 live births, which does not sound catastrophic, until you remember that Roman women might go through 5, 6, 7, 8 pregnancies across their reproductive years. With each pregnancy that risk accumulated, the cumulative lifetime risk of dying in childbirth for a Roman woman who had multiple children was genuinely significant. Estimates range from around 1 in 50 to perhaps higher, depending on the period, the social class, and the availability of skilled attendants. For context, the modern maternal mortality rate in high-income countries is roughly 5 to 10 deaths per 100,000 live births. The Roman rate was likely somewhere around 1,000 to 1,500 per 100,000. That is a difference of 2 orders of magnitude. 2 orders of magnitude between the world Roman women lived in and the world most of us live in now. Every woman who entered labour in ancient Rome was entering genuine, measurable danger, and everyone in the room with her knew it. Let me take you into that room. Not the grand domus of an aristocratic family, though we will visit that too. Let us start somewhere more ordinary. A small apartment in one of Rome's crowded insulae on an upper floor, where the air is stale and the only light comes through a narrow window. A woman is in labour. She's perhaps 20 years old, perhaps younger. Her mother is with her if her mother is alive and nearby. A neighbour woman who has been through this before. A midwife if the family can afford one, or a woman in the building who has acquired some knowledge through experience. The room has been prepared with what preparations were available. Certain herbs, silphium, which Romans considered useful for various gynecological conditions, though its specific applications in childbirth are debated. Olive oil, which was used extensively in Roman medical practice. Clean water as clean as could be managed. Perhaps some poppy preparations. The Romans knew that poppy could dull pain, though their understanding of dosage was imprecise. There is a birthing chair. The sella obstetrica, a curved chair with a crescent-shaped opening in the seat designed to support the woman in an upright or semi-upright position during delivery. This was considered better than lying flat, which Romans understood correctly, tended to make labour more difficult and delivery harder. The midwife, the obstetrix, is the most important person in the room. The Roman midwife is someone I want to spend real time on because she has been almost entirely written out of the history we usually hear about ancient Rome, and that is a genuine loss. The obstetrix was a skilled practitioner, not a doctor. Roman medicine had male physicians trained in the Greek tradition who wrote treatises and gave advice, but in practice, actual childbirth was almost entirely in the hands of women. Male physicians attended difficult cases in theory, though the sources suggest that the modesty expectations of Roman society made it complex for a male physician to be physically present at a delivery in most circumstances. The midwife was the practitioner who was actually there, who had her hands in the work, who made the decisions in the moment, and the best midwives were highly regarded. A Roman physician named Soranus of Ephesus, who practiced in Rome during the reign of the Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century of the Common Era, wrote a comprehensive text on gynecology and obstetrics that is one of the most detailed medical documents to survive from the ancient world. In it, he describes at length the qualities of an ideal midwife. She should be literate, he says, intelligent, calm under pressure, strong enough physically to manage the demands of the work, possessed of good eyesight and slender fingers, this last quality being practically important in ways that do not require elaboration. She should have studied theory as well as practice. She should understand the signs of normal and abnormal labour. She should know how to reposition a baby presenting incorrectly, a skill that required both knowledge and courage, because a baby lying crosswise or feet first was a genuine emergency, and repositioning by hand was the only available intervention. Soranus describes these techniques with careful precision. He knew that the women who read his text or had it read to them were the ones who would be using the information in the most high-stakes circumstances imaginable. What about the spiritual dimension of childbirth? Because in Rome the practical and the sacred were never fully separate, and the approach of labour brought both into sharp, urgent focus. Roman women in labour prayed to specific deities associated with childbirth. Lucina, sometimes identified with Juno, sometimes treated as a separate goddess, was the protector of women in labour, the one who brought the child into the light. Her name is related to the Latin word for light lux, and her role was precisely what the name suggests, to bring the new life out of darkness and into the world. Prayers to Lucina before and during labour were not casual invocations. They were serious, urgent communications with the divine being who was understood to have direct power over survival. There was also the goddess Carmenta, one of the oldest Roman divinities connected to prophecy and childbirth, who was celebrated in January at a festival called the Carmentalia, observed specifically by Roman women. And Juno Lucina's temple on the Esquiline Hill was a genuine centre of female religious life. Archaeological evidence suggests that votive offerings were regularly deposited there by women's small terracotta figures representing wombs, swaddled infants' body parts associated with reproductive health, a woman praying before a difficult birth, a woman giving thanks after a safe delivery, a mother asking for a sick child's recovery. These small clay objects survived 2,000 years in the ground. The prayers that were spoken while placing them, those did not survive, but the hands that placed them were real. Let me tell you about a woman named Scribonia. Not the most famous woman in Roman history, she tends to appear in the margins of other people's stories. But her life, when you look at it directly, contains something that I think speaks to the experience of Roman motherhood in a way that touches something very deep. Scribonia was the second wife of the Emperor Augustus, married to him, for political reasons divorced by him on the very day she gave birth to their daughter, because Augustus had already decided to marry Livia instead, on the day of her daughter's birth. That daughter was Julia, the same Julia who would later be exiled by her father for the scandal that tore apart his moral legislation. Julia, whose complicated, difficult, ultimately tragic life was lived entirely in the shadow of the most powerful man in the world, who was also her father, who divorced her mother the day she was born. Scribonia could have walked away from that child. She was divorced. The child belonged to Augustus. Under Roman law, children stayed with the father. She had no legal claim to Julia, no official standing in her daughter's upbringing. She stayed anyway. Scribonia spent the rest of her life in close relationship with Julia. When Julia was eventually exiled to the island of Pandateria, in 2 before the Common Era, a bleak, isolated place with no wine, no male company, and apparently no comforts, Scribonia went with her. Voluntarily. She was an old woman by then. She did not have to go. No one required it of her. Her legal relationship to Julia was at that point essentially nothing. She went because Julia was her daughter, and a mother, it turns out, is not always determined by law. I want to talk about infant mortality now because it shaped Roman motherhood in ways that we need to understand if we want to understand these women honestly. We mentioned Cornelia briefly, mother of 12 who buried 10. This was not an extreme case by Roman standards. It was a tragic one, certainly. Cornelia felt every death there is no reason to imagine otherwise, but the sheer frequency of child death in the Roman world meant that Roman parents and Roman mothers in particular developed a relationship with loss that was woven into the fabric of ordinary life. Estimates suggest that perhaps 40% of Roman children died before their 5th birthday. Another 20% did not survive to adulthood. Reaching the age of 30 was in the actuarial sense a genuine achievement. How do you love a child in a world where the odds of losing that child are so high? The Roman answer, described by some ancient writers, was a kind of protective emotional distance in the earliest months and years. There was a documented practice of not naming a child until 8 or 9 days after birth, the dies lustricus, the day of purification, because the first days were so dangerous that formal naming and thus formal recognition of the child as a member of the family was delayed until survival seemed more likely. This has sometimes been interpreted as emotional coldness, as evidence that Romans did not love their young children the way we love ours. I think that interpretation is wrong. I think what we are seeing is a different strategy for managing the same unbearable love under conditions of much higher risk. The grief inscriptions on Roman children's tombs, the epitaphs carved by parents for children who died at 2, 3, 5, 7 years old, are among the most heartbreaking documents of the ancient world. They do not read like the records of people who had kept emotional distance. They read like people who had loved completely and lost completely and were trying to put words to something for which there were no adequate words. To my sweetest daughter, who lived 3 years and 22 days, to my son who was taken too soon, in whom I had placed all my hope, she was my light. Now she is gone. These are real. These are carved in stone. These are the words of parents, often the words of mothers, reaching across 2,000 years to say this child was here. This child was loved. This child mattered. Here is something that surprised me, and that I think deserves more attention than it usually gets. Roman medical writers, including Soranus, and also a female physician named Metrodora, who may have written one of the earliest surviving medical texts by a woman, developed an understanding of pregnancy and childbirth that was in some respects more practically sophisticated than you might expect. Soranus's work describes prenatal care recommendations, diet, exercise, what activities to avoid during pregnancy. He discusses the management of difficult labours in detail. He describes techniques for the care of newborns, including the examination of the infant for health and the management of common problems in the first days of life. This was not magical thinking. It was empirical medicine, imperfect, operating without germ theory or blood typing, or any of the fundamental tools of modern obstetrics, but based on careful observation and the accumulation of practical knowledge over generations. The knowledge lived primarily in women. The obstetrices passed it from practitioner to practitioner, from experienced midwife to apprentice, in a tradition of female medical knowledge that existed largely outside the formal male medical establishment. When Soranus wrote it down, he was in many ways codifying what women had already been doing and knowing for generations. The midwives of Rome carried medical knowledge in their hands and their memories that helped women survive. It was not enough, not nearly enough by modern standards. But it was real, and it mattered, and the women who possessed it were doing something that deserves to be recognized as genuine expertise. Let me bring this chapter toward its close with something that I have been holding back because I wanted it to land in the right place. The Roman world was, as we have said many times across this series, built on a very specific set of expectations about what women were for: to bear children, to raise citizens, to continue the family line, to keep the household running while the men made history. Childbirth was the most literal expression of all of that, the moment where the social expectation and the physical reality of a woman's life converged in the most immediate possible way. And yet, what I keep finding as I move through the evidence is that in the space of labour and delivery and the terrifying early days of a new life in that raw, unmediated space, something else was also happening. Women helping women. The midwife's hands, the neighbour who had been through it before, the mother who came, the friend who stayed, the Vestal virgins whose prayers were believed to have real power and who were sometimes petitioned specifically for help in difficult labours. In the room where a Roman woman faced the most dangerous moment of her life, she was almost never alone. There was a network. Quiet, largely unrecorded, functional a network of women who knew what this was, who had been through it, who showed up because someone needed them there. That network does not appear in the official history of Rome. It does not appear in the Senate records or the military dispatches or the philosophical treatises or the great speeches of great men, but it was there, in every generation, in every neighbourhood, in every class of Roman society. Women holding each other through the hardest thing. And that, I think, is as much a part of the story of Roman women as anything else we have discussed. Coming up next, we step into a part of Roman women's lives that almost never gets discussed, and that I find in some ways the most quietly revolutionary of all. The Roman economy, the businesses women ran, the property they owned, the commercial transactions they conducted in a world that said they needed a man's signature for everything, and then in practice left them to manage enormous financial operations largely on their own. The invisible economy. The money that moved through Roman women's hands, that built buildings and funded trades and kept estates alive, money that the history books have almost entirely forgotten to mention. That story is right around the corner. Here is a question that historians spent a long time not asking. Where did the money come from? Not the money that funded the legions or the building programs, or the grain dole that kept Rome's population fed. That money, everyone knows where that came from. Taxes, conquest, the extraction of resources from 100 provinces across 3 continents. I mean the other money. The money that moved through the economy of daily Roman life. The money that kept the brick kilns running and the vineyards producing and the apartment buildings standing and the trading networks functioning across the Mediterranean world. When historians started looking carefully at the actual documentary evidence, the wax tablets, the papyri, the inscriptions, the legal records they found, something that the traditional narrative of Roman economic life had almost entirely overlooked. Women were everywhere in it. Not in the margins, not as occasional exceptions. Everywhere. Running businesses, owning property, making loans, managing estates, operating commercial enterprises at a scale that once you see it is genuinely impossible to explain away as incidental. The invisible economy of ancient Rome turns out to have had a great deal of female fingerprints on it, and the story of how we almost missed that entirely is in its own way as interesting as the story itself. Let us start with the legal framework, because understanding the gap between what the law said and what actually happened is the key to understanding everything else. Roman law, as we have mentioned across this series, required adult women, with certain exceptions, to conduct formal legal transactions under the supervision of a male guardian, a tutor. This guardian had to be present for significant financial dealings, the sale of property, the making of a will, the entering into a major contract. On paper, this looks like an almost total restriction on female economic independence. In practice, it was considerably more porous than it appears. First, the guardian's role evolved significantly over the centuries. In the earlier Republic, the tutor had genuine veto power over a woman's financial decisions. But by the late Republic, and certainly by the imperial period, legal scholars note that the guardian's role had become largely ceremonial in many cases. A woman who wanted to conduct a transaction found a cooperative guardian, often a family member, sometimes a professional who provided the required formal presence without actually directing or controlling the substance of the deal. The tutor became in many practical situations a rubber stamp. Second, the exceptions to the guardianship requirement were significant and growing. As we noted in Part 3, women with 3 children were exempt from guardianship under the legislation of Augustus. Vestal virgins were always exempt. Freed women with 4 children were exempt. And over time, the categories of transactions requiring formal guardianship shrank. Third, and this is the part that I find most fascinating, Roman women appear to have simply gotten on with business in ways that the formal legal structure did not fully account for, because the formal legal structure was not the only thing governing daily economic life. Let me give you something concrete. In the buried ruins of Herculaneum, the city destroyed alongside Pompeii by the eruption of Vesuvius, in the 79th year of the Common Era, archaeologists discovered an extraordinary archive of wax tablets belonging to a Roman banking family called the Sulpicii. These tablets are financial records, loan agreements, receipts, acknowledgements of debt, records of transactions conducted through the banking house. They cover roughly the period from 26 to 61 of the Common Era, and women appear throughout them. Not as passive recipients of financial arrangements made by male relatives, as parties to transactions, making loans, receiving loans, conducting business through the banking house. A woman named Phoebe appears in the archive conducting financial business. A woman named Balbia Philonicus appears. A freed woman named Dionetto appears managing financial affairs of some complexity. These are not aristocratic women with vast inherited wealth. These are women of middling status, some of them freed women, former enslaved people, who'd been manumitted and were building lives in the commercial world of the Bay of Naples. They were using the banking system. They were transacting. They were present in the economy as genuine economic actors. And then there is Pompeii itself. Pompeii is the most extraordinary gift that an ancient catastrophe has ever accidentally given to historians. The city froze in the 79th year of the Common Era, not just physically, but documentarily. The election notices painted on walls, the advertisements for businesses, the graffiti, the inscriptions, and among all of that evidence of women in commercial life that is simply impossible to explain away. We already met Eumachia in Part 4, the woman who funded the building in the Forum and was honoured by the textile workers. But she is only the most prominent example of something that appears to have been genuinely widespread. Archaeologists and epigraphers studying Pompeii have identified numerous women as property owners, business operators and commercial figures in the city's economic life. A woman named Umbricia Januaria appears to have been involved in the fish sauce trade garum, the fermented fish condiment that was to Roman cuisine what olive oil was to the cooking an absolute staple, and also a significant commercial product traded across the entire Mediterranean. Fish sauce was not a small industry, it was big business, and women appear in it. A woman named Julia Felix owned a large property in Pompeii that she rented out commercially, including a bathhouse, a garden, shops and upper floor apartments. An inscription from the property survives that is essentially a rental advertisement, offering the various commercial spaces for 5-year leases. Julia Felix was a landlord, operating a diversified commercial property, advertising her rentals publicly. This is not a woman defined by her domestic virtue and her relationship to the loom. This is a businesswoman. Here is what I find personally interesting about this evidence, and I want to share this as a genuine reflection rather than just a historical observation. For a very long time, the story we told about the Roman economy largely left women out. Not because historians were deliberately hiding anything, I do not think that is what happened, but because the sources that historians traditionally relied on most heavily were the literary sources, the philosophical texts, the political histories, and those sources written almost entirely by elite Roman men reflected a worldview in which women were domestic creatures whose economic activities were incidental at best. When scholars started paying more systematic attention to the documentary evidence, the tablets, the papyri, the inscriptions, the archaeological material, a different picture emerged. The gap between what Roman literary culture said women did and what Roman documentary evidence shows women actually doing is striking. It is a reminder that the story we have about any historical world is shaped by what evidence survives, who created that evidence, and who gets to decide what counts as significant. The women who made loans in Herculaneum did not write philosophical treatises about it. They just made the loans. The receipt survived anyway. Let me take you to Egypt for a moment, because the Roman province of Egypt has given us an unusually rich documentary record from the ancient world, preserved by the dry desert climate in ways that are simply not possible in the more humid Italian heartland. From Roman Egypt, particularly from the period between the 1st century before the Common Era and the 4th century of the Common Era, we have thousands of papyri containing contracts, letters, legal documents, petitions, and records of daily life. And women are everywhere in them. A woman named Aurelia Charité from the city of Hermopolis in Egypt appears in multiple papyri from the early 4th century of the Common Era. She owned agricultural land. She leased land to tenant farmers. She received rent. She petitioned officials about various matters concerning her property. She was managing an agricultural estate across multiple years, dealing with tenants, handling disputes, navigating the bureaucracy of Roman provincial administration, entirely under her own name. Aurelia Charité was not an exception. She is simply better documented than most because more of her papyri happened to survive. The patterns visible in her documents appear across the Egyptian papyri repeatedly. Women owning land, managing agricultural operations, engaging with the legal and administrative systems of the Roman province. In Roman Egypt, the guardianship requirement appears to have been applied inconsistently, and in many cases simply bypassed in practice. Women signed documents. Women appeared in courts. Women conducted business. The law said one thing, life required another. Now I want to talk about a different kind of female economic power, one that is less visible in the documentary record, but arguably more significant in terms of pure scale. The management of large aristocratic estates. We have mentioned this before in the context of the matrona and her role in the household, but I want to go deeper into the economic dimension specifically, because they are remarkable. A large Roman senatorial family in the imperial period might own properties scattered across multiple provinces, agricultural estates in Italy, Spain and North Africa, the eastern provinces. The total land holdings of the wealthiest Roman families were genuinely vast. Some of them encompass thousands of acres, producing grain, wine, olive oil, and various other agricultural products for both family use and commercial sale. Managing these holdings required continuous attention, decisions about what to plant, when to sell, how to maintain the workforce, when to invest in improvements, how to handle poor harvests, how to manage the complex relationships with tenant farmers, managers, and enslaved agricultural workers. When the paterfamilias was in Rome conducting politics, or when he died and left a widow with minor children, these decisions fell to the women of the family, and the evidence suggests that many of them made those decisions competently and consequentially. The jurist Gaius, writing in the 2nd century of the Common Era, describes various legal situations involving women's management of family property with a matter-of-factness that suggests this was entirely ordinary. He is not expressing surprise that women managed property. He is providing legal guidance for the situations that arose from the fact that they did, Let me tell you about a woman whose economic power became so significant that it created a political problem. Her name was Plautilla. She was the daughter of Gaius Fulvius Plautianus, the Praetorian prefect, the commander of the imperial guard under the Emperor Septimius Severus in the early 3rd century of the Common Era. She married the emperor's son Caracalla, making her a future empress. Plautianus accumulated enormous wealth and political influence, and some of that wealth and influence was channeled through and associated with his daughter. When Plautianus fell from favour and was killed in 205 of the Common Era, Plautilla was exiled and her property was confiscated. The confiscation of her property was a significant enough event to be recorded, which tells us that she had significant property to confiscate. A woman whose economic assets were large enough that seizing them was worth noting in the historical record. This pattern, women of the imperial family or the senatorial aristocracy, accumulating personal wealth that was genuinely substantial and independently managed, repeats throughout Roman imperial history. Livia, the wife of Augustus, owned property across the empire, brickyards, estates, commercial interests. Her personal wealth was by some accounts among the largest private fortunes in Rome. She managed it personally with her own staff of enslaved and freed workers. The Empress Julia Domna, wife of Septimius Severus, whom we mentioned briefly in the context of powerful imperial women, was known as a patron of philosophy, literature, and the arts which requires money. Her own, managed by her. These were not women receiving allowances from their husbands. These were women with financial portfolios. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think it matters. When we picture economic power, the kind of power that shapes markets, builds industries, directs the movement of resources, do we automatically picture men? Even now, with everything that has changed in the last century, I think most of us still carry some version of that default assumption. The images we have absorbed of who runs things, who makes the big financial decisions, who is at the centre of economic life, those images are still predominantly male. Now imagine how much more total that assumption was in the Roman world. And yet the evidence keeps showing us women, managing estates, conducting loans, owning property, running businesses, making decisions that moved real resources through the Roman economy in ways that mattered. They were doing all of this in a world that officially said they should not have to, that a man should be handling these things, that a woman's proper sphere was the household and the loom. The gap between the official story and the actual story is so large that it almost seems like two different worlds occupying the same time and space. In one world, the Roman woman is modest, domestic dependent. In the other world, she's signing rental contracts and managing brickyards and lending money through banking houses. Both worlds were real. They coexisted in the same city, on the same streets, sometimes in the same family. There is one final piece of this economic picture that I want to share because it connects the financial and the personal in a way that I find genuinely moving. The Roman legal concept of the peculium, a form of property that could be held separately within a household, was originally developed to allow enslaved people to hold and manage a small amount of property, even though legally they owned nothing and were themselves owned. Over time, variations of this concept were applied to other legally constrained people within the Roman household system, including daughters and wives. A woman might have a peculium, a set of resources that were understood informally or formally to be specifically hers to manage. Not large necessarily, not legally independent from the household in the strictest sense, but practically treated as her own. Her pins and needles, as one scholar has described it, her small savings, her particular resources, and in the hands of a capable woman over years and decades that peculium could grow. The woman who started with a small personal fund and ended up managing an estate did not do it overnight. She did it the way anyone builds anything incrementally carefully, using what she had to get more demonstrating competence, until the scope of her responsibility expanded to match it. Rome did not give women economic power, but it also did not entirely succeed in keeping it from them. They built it anyway, in the spaces between the rules, with what they had. We're getting close now to the end of our journey through this world. We've been through so much together, the girl with no name of her own, the bride lifted over the threshold, the midwife's hands in the lamplight, the woman at the loom, who was also managing a commercial empire, the Vestal, walking through the forum with lictors before her and the power of life and death in her gesture. But there is something we've not yet addressed. The voice. The actual literal voice of Roman women, what they wrote, what they said, what they left behind in language. Because there is a poet. One Roman woman whose words survived the collapse of empires and the burning of libraries, and 2,000 years of a world that was not particularly interested in preserving the literary output of women. Her name is Sulpicia, and what she wrote in 6 short elegies that slipped into the collected works of a male poet, and were almost attributed to him instead of her, is something I have been waiting to share with you since the very beginning of this series. That story is next. Somewhere in Rome around the year 19 before the Common Era, a young woman sat down and wrote a love poem. This by itself is not remarkable. Romans wrote love poetry constantly. It was practically a civic pastime. Catullus had done it. Propertius was doing it. Ovid would make an entire career out of it. The love elegy was one of the most fashionable literary forms of the Augustan age, and educated Romans consumed it the way we consume, well, whatever it is you consume when you want something emotionally charged and beautifully crafted. But here is what was different about this particular poem. It was written by a woman, in her own name, about a man she had chosen to love, and she was not apologizing for any of it. Her name was Sulpicia. She came from one of the most distinguished families in Rome. Her uncle, or possibly her guardian, the sources are slightly ambiguous on the exact relationship, was Marcus Valerius Messala, Corvinus, a significant military commander and literary patron, who gathered around himself a circle of the best poets of his generation. Tibullus was part of that circle, Sulpicia was part of that circle, and she wrote 6 elegies survive that are attributed to her 6 short poems, none of them very long, all of them intimate and direct and charged with a kind of emotional honesty that is, even across 2,000 years of distance, genuinely striking. Her poems were preserved because they were included in a manuscript collection of the works of Tibullus. For a long time, scholars debated whether the poems were actually hers. Some argued they must have been written by a man imitating a female voice, because surely a Roman woman of good family would not have written this openly about love and desire, and the choices she had made. Most modern scholars now accept Sulpicia's authorship. The argument that a man must have written them because they are too good or too frank is, when examined, plainly not an argument at all. It is an assumption about what women could and could not do, dressed up as textual analysis. She wrote them. They are hers. Let me describe what is in them, because they matter beyond their literary value. Sulpicia is in love with a man she calls Cerinthus, possibly a pseudonym, as was common in Roman love poetry, possibly a real name lightly disguised. She writes about wanting him. She writes about the secrecy that their relationship requires, and her ambivalence about that secrecy. She writes about being prevented from seeing him. Her guardian has made plans for her to travel to the country on her birthday, away from Rome, away from Cerinthus, and she is furious about it. She writes about the plans being cancelled and her joy at returning to the city. She writes in one poem about having been with him, physically, and she says, and this is the line that has stopped readers in their tracks for centuries, that she is glad she did it, and she hopes he is too, and she has no interest in hiding it, behind the kind of careful discretion that Roman women were expected to maintain. She says essentially, I chose this. I am not ashamed. I would choose it again. In a world that monitored female sexuality as a matter of civic virtue, that punished adultery by law, that built an entire social architecture around the idea that a woman's most important characteristic was her sexual purity and her faithful containment within her husband's household, Sulpicia wrote 6 poems that said clearly and in elegant Latin, I am a person. I have desires. I made choices, and they are mine. I want to pause here and just sit with what it means that these poems survived. Of all the things written in Rome across its centuries of literary production, the treatises, the histories, the speeches, the correspondence, the poetry, almost all of it written by men, these 6 short poems by a young woman who fell in love and wrote about it, are among the very, very few surviving documents in which we hear a Roman woman speaking in her own voice about her own inner life, not about history, not about politics, not filtered through a husband's household management or a son's political career or an institution like the Vestals. Her own feelings, her own choices, her own self unmediated. 6 poems. That is what survives of the inner life of Roman womanhood across centuries of civilization. 6 poems? The gap between what those women experienced and what was recorded is so vast that it is almost incomprehensible, and the fact that these 6 slipped through, tucked into someone else's manuscript, preserved more or less by accident, feels to me like an extraordinary piece of historical luck, like finding one letter in the ruins of a library that burned down. One letter, but the right one. Now Sulpicia is the most famous female literary voice from ancient Rome, but she is not entirely alone. There were other women who wrote. The sources refer to them sometimes by name. The poet Ovid mentions several female poets of his acquaintance, with what appears to be genuine admiration. A woman named Cornelia wrote poetry that was apparently well regarded enough to be mentioned by multiple ancient writers. Virtually nothing of her work survives. A woman named Proba, writing much later in the 4th century of the Common Era, composed a work called a cento, a poem assembled from lines of Virgil, rearranged to tell the stories of the Christian Bible. This was a genuine literary achievement requiring deep knowledge of Virgil and considerable creative skill. It survived. It was read and copied and circulated. A woman named Perpetua, not a literary figure in the professional sense, but a young Christian woman of Carthage who was imprisoned in 203 of the Common Era for her faith, wrote a prison diary. It is one of the earliest surviving texts written by a Christian woman, and it is extraordinarily vivid. She describes her visions, her fears, her love for her infant son, her relationship with her father who begged her to recant, and her preparation for death. Perpetua was 22 years old when she was killed. Her diary survived because her fellow Christians preserved it as a sacred text. It was not preserved because the Roman literary establishment valued women's writing. It was preserved because a community of people who loved her considered what she had written to be holy. Here is something that I think deserves more attention than it usually gets. The women we have been discussing throughout this entire series, the aristocratic matronae, the Vestal virgins, the businesswomen of Pompeii, the midwives, the women in the Bonadea ceremony, most of them were literate, not all of them. Literacy in the ancient world was far from universal, and women's access to formal education was, as we discussed in Part 1, considerably more restricted than men's. But among women of the upper and middle classes, literacy was common, perhaps expected. Women read. They wrote letters. They kept household accounts. Wealthy women had book scrolls in their homes and read them. We know this from incidental references throughout the ancient literature, from the occasional surviving letter, written by a woman from the evidence of women engaged with philosophical and literary culture. Pliny, the younger's wife Calpurnia, who we mentioned in part 2, the woman whose absence kept Pliny awake at night, read his writings, learned his speeches, set his poems to music. This is described as unusually devoted, but the capacity it represents, literacy, musicianship, genuine intellectual engagement, was clearly not exceptional. It was something that educated women had. The problem was not that Roman women lacked the capacity to produce lasting literature. The problem was structural. Writing for publication, entering the literary marketplace, seeking a patron, circulating work in the networks that gave Roman literature its audience and its permanence was a male institution. A woman who wrote kept it in the family, circulated it privately, perhaps shared it within the household's literary circle. Sulpicia's poem survived because she was in Messalla's literary circle. If she'd been born into a less connected family, or if her guardian had been less interested in poetry, those 6 elegies would be as lost as everything else. Proximity to power saved them. Everything else went with the fire. Let me tell you about Julia Domna because her story brings together everything we've been discussing: political influence, intellectual life, female power, and the limits of all of it, in a way that feels like a conclusion to something. Julia Domna was born in the Syrian city of Emesa around the year 160 of the Common Era into the family of the high priest of the sun god of that city. She was educated, intellectually ambitious, and apparently strikingly charismatic. She married the Roman general Septimius Severus, who would go on to become emperor reportedly, because an astrologer had told him he should marry a woman destined to be a queen. She became empress, and she did not stop there. Julia Domna gathered around herself in Rome a philosophical and literary circle, a genuine intellectual salon, a gathering place for the best thinkers of the early 3rd century of the Common Era. Philosophers, historians, medical writers, mathematicians. She corresponded with intellectuals across the empire. She commissioned biographies. She engaged with philosophical questions at serious level. The philosopher Philostratus, who was part of her circle, dedicated a work to her. He describes her as someone whose commitment to philosophy was genuine and deep, not decorative. She was given titles that had never been given to a Roman empress before: Mother of the Army, Mother of the Senate, Mother of the Fatherland. She travelled with her husband on military campaigns. She was present at the administrative centre of an empire that spanned from Scotland to Mesopotamia. When Septimius Severus died in the city of Eboracum, modern York in northern Britain, in the year 211 of the Common Era, Julia Domna did not retire quietly to grieve. She continued. She managed the correspondence of her son Caracalla, who was not particularly interested in administration. She was in practical terms running the empire's paperwork while her son ran its armies, and then Caracalla was killed. Her younger son Gaeta was already dead, murdered by Caracalla himself. Her world collapsed around her. Julia Domna died in the same year as her son, 217 of the Common Era. The ancient sources say she stopped eating. Whether this was illness or deliberate choice we cannot know with certainty. She was perhaps in her mid-50s. She had been at the centre of Roman power for nearly 30 years. She had done it without a single official title that reflected what she actually was. Do you see the pattern? Running all the way from Aurelia, who monitored her daughter-in-law and helped shape Julius Caesar, to Julia Domna, who managed imperial correspondence, while officially holding only the title of Empress. Roman women of influence almost always operated through positions that were defined by their relationship to a man. Mother, wife, sister. The titles were relational. The power was real. This is not a small thing. The relational framing was not just inconvenient labelling. It was a genuine constraint on how that power could be exercised, how durable it was, how easily it could be stripped away, when the man it was attached to died or fell, or was exiled, or chose someone else. Women who built power through a son lost it when the son died. Women who built it through a husband lost it when the husband did. The only durable female power in Rome was the kind that transcended the relational, the Vestal Virgin's institutional authority, which was hers regardless of any man's fate, or the businesswoman's property which was registered in her name, and would remain hers through divorce and widowhood. Everything else was borrowed with skill and intelligence, and sometimes with genuine courage, but borrowed. What do we do with all of this? I have been sitting with that question across this entire series, and I want to try to answer it honestly rather than just elegantly. I think the honest answer is we look at it clearly. We do not romanticize it and we do not flatten it. We do not turn the Roman world into a simple story about oppression, because the women in it were not simple victims. They were complex people who navigated a complex world with remarkable resourcefulness and occasional brilliance. And we do not turn it into a story of hidden empowerment that retroactively makes the constraints acceptable, because the constraints were real, and they cost real women real things. We hold both. The Vestal, who had more freedom than any other Roman woman, and who could be buried alive. The businesswoman managing her estate and needing a guardian's rubber stamp to do it legally. Sulpicia writing her love poetry and being one of the only women whose voice survived at all. The complexity is the truth, and the truth in my experience is always more interesting than either the simplified story of victimhood or the simplified story of triumph. We're almost at the end of our journey now. One more chapter remains, and in that final chapter we're going to do something I have been building towards since the very first words of part 1. We're going to ask the question that all of this has been circling around. What do we actually know about these women, not what the men of Rome said about them, not what the laws assigned them, not what the ideals required of them? What do we actually know? What survives in stone and clay and papyrus and the occasional 6 poems tucked into someone else's manuscript? And what does the gap between what survives and what was lived tell us about the nature of history itself, about whose stories get kept and whose get lost, and why that matters for how we understand not just the past but the present? That conversation is the last one, and I think it might be the most important one we have had in this entire series. Stay with me for just a little longer. We have come a long way together. 11 chapters, 12 women whose names we said out loud, hundreds of lives we touched briefly and then had to leave behind. And now we are here at the end, or perhaps more accurately at the place where the story opens into something larger than itself. I want to start this final chapter with an object, something small, something you could hold in one hand. In the collections of the British Museum in London there is a carved ivory doll. She's approximately 17 centimetres tall. Her arms and legs are jointed, they can be moved posed. Her hair is carved in an elaborate style, consistent with the fashions of the 2nd century of the Common Era. Her face is calm, slightly idealized the way Roman portrait art tends to be. She was found in a stone sarcophagus in Rome, buried alongside the body of a girl who died sometime in the 2nd century. The girl was perhaps 8 years old, perhaps 10. She was buried with her doll because whoever loved her wanted her to have it with her. The doll survived. The girl's name did not. That gap between what survives and what is lost is what this final chapter is really about. Because across the 11 parts of this series we have been doing something that I want to name clearly now that we are at the end. We have been reconstruction work. We have been taking fragments, a carved doll, a wax tablet with a woman's name on a loan document, 6 poems tucked into a manuscript, a rental advertisement in Pompeii, an epitaph for a child who lived 3 years and 22 days, and we've been trying to build from those fragments something that resembles the actual lived reality of Roman women. And the honest thing to say as we close is that what we built is partial. It is always partial. The full truth of those lives, what they felt waking up in the morning, what they thought about their world, what they grieved and hoped and laughed about, what they wished had been different, most of that is gone. Not archived somewhere waiting to be found. Gone. Dissolved into the same 2,000 years of time that dissolved everything else that was not deliberately preserved. What was deliberately preserved tells us something important about power. Think about what survived from ancient Rome and why. The Senate record survived because institutions preserved their own documentation. The military dispatches survived because empires track their armies. The great speeches survived Cicero's orations, preserved and copied because Roman education used them as models of rhetoric for centuries. The philosophical treatises survived because educated men copied them and valued them, and included them in the curriculum. The histories survived Livy, Tacitus, Suetonius, because subsequent generations considered them essential to understanding Rome. And who wrote all of those things? Men. Elite, educated, politically connected Roman men, writing about the things that elite, educated, politically connected Roman men considered worth writing about. Women appear in those documents the way they appear in the margins of a page, present enough to be noticed, not present enough to be the subject. The financial tablets from Herculaneum survived because they were buried under volcanic material and happened to be excavated in the modern era. The papyri from Egypt survived because the desert preserved them. Sulpicia's poems survived because they were hidden inside someone else's collection. The doll survived because a grieving family put it in a stone box. Accident, geology, misfiling. These are the mechanisms by which Roman women's lives reached us, not intention. Not a civilization deciding that these lives mattered enough to preserve. Accident. And here is what I want to sit with because I think it is the most important observation of this entire series. The gaps in the historical record are not neutral. When a story is missing, the missing story is not just an absence. It shapes everything around it. It shapes what we think we know. It shapes the questions we ask and the questions we do not think to ask. It shapes who we think was important and who we assume was incidental. For a very long time, the history of ancient Rome was taught and written as if women were essentially decorative elements in a fundamentally male story. Present, occasionally interesting, but not really the main event. And then historians started looking at the actual evidence more carefully, started reading the inscriptions more systematically, started taking the papyri seriously as economic documents, started asking different questions, and the picture changed. Not completely, we're still working with fragments, we will always be working with fragments, but significantly, enough to understand that the women we have met across these 11 chapters were not background figures. They were not supporting characters in someone else's story. They were people. Fully, completely irreducibly, people with inner lives and economic activities and political influence and religious devotion and intellectual ambition and love affairs and grief and hope and all the other things that make a life a life. The story that left them out was incomplete. This series has been my attempt to fill in some of what was missing. Let me tell you about one more object before we close. In 1973, archaeologists excavating a Roman fort at Vindolanda in northern Britain on the edge of Hadrian's Wall, the great stone barrier that marked the northern frontier of the Roman Empire, discovered something extraordinary. Thin wooden tablets preserved in the waterlogged soil covered in ink writing. The Vindolanda tablets, as they are now called, are the largest collection of Roman writing on wood ever found. They include military reports, supply requests, duty rosters, letters between officers, and among them, dated to around the year 100 of the Common Era, is a letter from a woman named Claudia Severa to a woman named Sulpicia Lepidina. Claudia Severa was the wife of the commander of a nearby fort. Sulpitia Lepidina was the wife of the commander of Vindolanda. Claudia Severa was writing to invite her friend to her birthday party. She writes, and I am paraphrasing the spirit of it because the Latin is fragmentary, that she hopes Sulpicia Lepidina will come, that it would make her very happy to have her there, that she sends warm greetings to her and to her husband and their household. At the bottom of the letter, in a slightly different handwriting, scholars believe it is Claudia Severa's own hand added. After her secretary wrote the main body, there are a few words of personal greeting, warmer, more intimate. The difference between what you dictate to a secretary and what you add yourself at the end because you want her to know you mean it. This letter is the earliest known example of Latin writing by a woman, a birthday party invitation, written at the edge of the world in a Roman fort on the border of Scotland 2,000 years ago. A woman asking her friend to come to her birthday. I have thought about Claudia Severa and Sulpicia Lepidina many times while working on this series. I do not know if Sulpicia Lepidina went to the party. I do not know if the two women were close friends across years or relatively new acquaintances. I do not know what they talked about when they were together. Whether they complained about the cold British weather, which must have been a significant adjustment from Italy, or the provinces further south, whether they talked about their children, their husbands, the political news from Rome, the difficulty of finding good olive oil at the edge of the empire. I do not know any of that. What I know is that Claudia Severa wanted her friend there, and that she added a line in her own handwriting to make sure Sulpicia Lepidina knew it was genuine. That small human gesture, the personal postscript the thing added, because the formal letter did not quite capture the warmth of what you meant, is so entirely recognizable that it crosses 2,000 years without any effort at all. We do that. We still do that. We send the formal message and then we add the personal note because we want them to know we mean it. That continuity, that unbroken thread of ordinary human wanting to connect that runs from Claudia Severa's wooden tablet to whatever message you sent to a friend today, is, I think, the most important thing I have learned from spending this much time with the women of ancient Rome. They were not a different kind of people. They were not alien, incomprehensible, so shaped by a different world that we cannot recognize them. They were people, doing what people do, loving their children and managing their households and fighting for their rights and keeping secrets and writing letters to invite their friends to birthday parties. The world they lived in was deeply different from ours, more dangerous, less free, organized around assumptions about gender and power and human worth that we have spent centuries slowly and imperfectly trying to revise. But the people inside that world were recognizable. Cornelia calling her sons her jewels, Sulpicia writing about love without apology, Claudia Severa adding a postscript, the Vestal who tended the flame for 57 years, the midwife whose hands knew things that no text had written down, the woman in the insula carrying water up 5 flights of stairs before the sun came up. All of them recognizable, all of them real. Here is what I want to leave you with, and I want to say it as plainly as I can. History is not just the past, it is the story we tell about the past. And the story we tell is always a choice about whose experiences we consider worth recovering, whose voices we consider worth listening, for whose lives we consider worth the effort of reconstruction. For a very long time, the history of Rome was told in a way that made those choices largely without examining them. Men were the subject because men left the most records, because men held the most official power, because the institutions designed to preserve things were designed by and for men. That is a description, not an accusation. It is simply what happened. But we get to make different choices now. We get to go back to the fragments, the dolls and the tablets and the 6 poems and the birthday party invitation, and ask what they tell us about the lives they came from. We get to read the gaps as information rather than absences. We get to treat the parallel culture, the invisible economy, the secret ceremonies, the midwife's knowledge, the postscript in a woman's own hand. We get to treat all of that as history too. Real history, not supplementary, not a footnote to the real story. The real story. A girl was born in Rome 2,000 years ago. She was given her father's name in the feminine. She played with a jointed ivory doll in a painted courtyard. She left the doll on an altar the morning of her wedding. She crossed a threshold or was lifted over it into a life she had not entirely chosen. She managed a household and raised children and kept accounts, and prayed at a small shrine in the kitchen, and worked wool by lamplight, and knew things that were never written down. She grew old, or she did not, the odds were never in her favour. And then she was gone, and the doll survived. And we are here 2,000 years later holding the doll and trying to imagine the hands that made it, and the hands that played with it, and the hands that placed it on an altar in an act that was both a goodbye and a beginning. That act of imagination, the reaching across time toward a life that the record almost entirely forgot, is, I believe, one of the most important things we can do. Because the girl who had no name of her own deserves to be looked for. She deserves to be found. Thank you. Thank you for spending this time with me, with these women, with this world that is so distant and so strangely close. 11 chapters of Roman history, 12 women named hundreds of lives glimpsed briefly in the lamplight, and I hope that what you carry away from all of it is not a collection of facts, though the facts are real and they matter. I hope what you carry away is a feeling, the feeling of a world that was full, absolutely full of people whose inner lives were as rich and complicated and worthy of attention as anyone who ever had a biography written about them. The feeling that the gaps in the record are not emptiness, but presence. All those unwritten lives pressing against the edges of what survived. The feeling that history is not finished, that there is always more to recover, more to understand, more to honour. If this series made you curious about something about Roman history, about ancient women, about the way stories get told and the way they get lost, then it did what I hoped it would do. And if there is a woman in your own life or in your own history whose story has not been fully told, I hope this series makes you want to tell it. Because those stories matter. They have always mattered. We just have to decide to look for them. There is so much more history waiting for us. So many more quiet worlds that the official record almost forgot. So many more lives lived in the spaces between the things that got written down. If you want to keep exploring them together, if you want to keep following the thread through the centuries and the civilizations and the hidden corners of the past, then you know what to do. Stay close. The next story is already waiting, and I promise you it is worth the wait.